I'd like to first introduce Dr. Jim Brosnan with the University of Tennessee. He is a professor in the Department of Plant Sciences, as well as being head of the Weed Diagnostics Center with UT. Dr. Brosnan received his PhD in Turfgrass Sciences from Penn State University, and his research focuses on effective and economical strategies for broadleaf and grassy weed control across various turfgrass systems, including golf courses, athletic fields, and even residential landscapes. His extension programs provide education and diagnostic support to more than to Tennessee's audience, which actually encompasses nearly 5.8 billion in the turfgrass industry. Today, Jim's going to be talking about turfgrass weed control for 2021. With that, Jim, take it away. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Lee, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in this new virtual world. I think we've all kind of learned a lot in the previous 12 months and are getting used to doing things in this platform, and it's a little bit more familiar. So hopefully we can have a nice discussion without any technical glitches or anything on Zoom this morning, and I'm confident that we can. What we've done, Greg Breeden and I sat down knowing that we kind of work in tandem at UT, and we cover a wide swath of weed control research. We wanted to share kind of lessons learned in 2020 that would be relevant to you, predominantly working in the lawn care industry, and do it in a way that we weren't overlapping. So what I'm going to do to begin kind of the turfgrass weed control portion is talk about lessons learned pertaining to grass control. And then Greg's going to talk a little bit more about sedges and broadleaf weed control. And then we've both intentionally kind of left our presentations short of the allotted time to give an opportunity for questions. One of the most rewarding things about extension meetings like this one is kind of the Q&A with you all in the audience. And just because we're on Zoom doesn't mean we don't do that. You know, Greg and I would love to answer any questions you have about what we've presented in these series of talks this morning, or anything else moving forward. So with that kind of as a little bit of a preface of how we've structured this, I'll get into my portion. And, you know, there's kind of a subtitle or tagline here. The more things change, the more they stayed the same in 2020. And I kind of mean that in all seriousness. You know, before I get into anything really technical about weed control, I'd say that, you know, one of the things that I learned in 2020 is that it's really good to work in the turfgrass industry, and really the green industry in general. I think that, you know, we were fortunate in the spring of 2020 that green industry work was deemed essential in our state, and most of us were able to continue and be employed and do what we do. And with all of the economic contraction that's happened in the country, that's a good thing. And I also think more importantly than that, you know, for me, there was more of an appreciation for green space in 2020 than I've seen in my time in UT. And that is, you know, a commentary on the golf course industry. It's a commentary on parks and recreational areas. I think just the general public at large had an appreciation for green space and being outside and all of the positive environmental and societal benefits that come from that, because I think we all spent too much time staring at screens, and when we had the opportunity to go outside and not stare at a screen, it was maybe more rewarding in 2020 than years past. That doesn't mean there won't be challenges moving forward. You know, one of the things that occurred in 2020 that I wanted to draw your attention to was, you know, kind of a realization amongst many folks working in the turfgrass extension specialists across the country, that, you know, many of you were dealing with budgets that were set pre-pandemic, and that could be budget budgets for supplies, equipment, or just labor. And, it remains to be seen as we move into 2021 and forward, what the economy will do to those budgets and how kind of the economics of our business might change. And to prepare for that, a group of researchers, including myself, published two national white papers on the benefits of turfgrass management. One you can see here is a justification for continued management of turfgrass during economic contraction. And then the other is economic minimums for mowing, fertilizing, and irrigating turfgrass. These were put together to touch on all facets of the industry. So lawn care, parks and recreation, sports field, and golf. And they were designed kind of with the eye that, you as a turfgrass manager might be in a position where you need to justify or make a case for resources to do what you do. And rather than just going on your word or kind of a commentary on, well, this is what we've always done, wanted to have a national white paper with all of the peer-reviewed scientific research that's out there on the benefits, both environmental and societal, for maintained turfgrass. So those are there and in open access publications for use. Getting into kind of the meat of the presentation today, though, one of the things that Greg and I do, and we challenge all the students that work with us to do this as well, is to think about, with all of the distraction we have in the world, and for our program, doing 150 different trials with hundreds of different treatments and multiple target weeds, when we distill all that variance down, what's our mission as a group? And our mission is to try to find ways to help with weed control in the field. And we can distill down everything we've learned into key takeaways. And that's how I've structured this presentation. And I think Greg's done a similar approach with his. And I think one of the key takeaways in 2020 was that, we had a lot of change, but grass weeds were still a problem. And a lot of the same grass weeds that are a problem every year were a problem in 2020. Smooth crabgrass or large crabgrass would be one. Roughstock bluegrass, which you can see up here, would be another. And then maybe even little barley, which is an often overlooked winter annual grass, another that would be problematic in 2020. And that's what I want to talk about in this presentation. Grass weeds, with everything that happened, grass weeds were still an issue last year and will still be an issue in 2021. If we look at our temperatures for Knoxville, I don't think we had that atypical of a year. So this is monthly average air temperature on the y-axis here from 0 to 80, and then month of the year along the x. 2020 is the gold bar, and 2019 is the green bar. And what you see, April and May were cooler. I think we had kind of a delayed start to summer, much cooler in April, much cooler in May, and we'll talk about what that did from a weed control standpoint. But when we got into the heat of the year, June, July, and August, we were pretty on par with 2019 from a temperature standpoint. So we had some cooling in spring, on par temperature-wise as we got into the summer. I don't think rainfall, though, would follow the same theme. So this graph that you're looking at is precipitation accumulation in inches for Knoxville. So on the Y, we have precipitation from 0 to 12 inches, and then the X, we have month of the year. And 2020 is the red, 2019 is the blue, I believe. I'm a little bit blocked out by my Zoom window here. And then 2018 is the gold. And to no surprise, we were wet this year. 2020 was a really, really wet year. Almost every single month of the year in Knoxville, our precipitation exceeded the 2 years prior. The only outlier was July. If we look at Chattanooga, we have no outliers, right? Every month of the year, we're above the previous 2 seasons, right? With more precipitation in January, February, March, April, all the way down the line. So that's a recipe for weeds, right? We had a cooler spring and a wet summer, and that's a pretty good equation that you're going to have a lot of weed issues. And that comes from a place of cool spring. Well, that allows for winter annual persistence into late May. Our group does a lot of work with Poa annua, a winter annual grass, and we saw Poa annua persist in turfgrass deeper into May than in the entirety of my 13 years at UT combined. We saw Poa trivialis, roughstock bluegrass, particularly in tall fescue lawns, persist longer into the summer than usual. You know, typically we get hot in mid to late May, and those Poa trivialis patches really weaken. We saw them go deeper into the summer than usual. And I think from a crabgrass standpoint, a lot of programs were probably put out a little bit too early because they use soil temperature as a trigger. And with the wet conditions we had throughout the year, plus an earlier starting date, that's a recipe for breakthrough. Now, I know most on the call are going to be familiar with border forsythia as an indicator for crabgrass germination in spring, where we see that plant bloom when soil temperatures are 55 Fahrenheit for 3 consecutive days at a 2-inch depth. And that's the same conditions where crabgrass begins to germinate and emerge. So we time our prees, really using that almost as a traffic light of when to start making our applications. If we look at our soil temperatures for Knoxville, we see an interesting story. So on the y-axis, there's soil temperature at a 2-inch depth in 2020. And then the x-axis is month of year. And I've put a red line in for 55 Fahrenheit. So this is going to be our kind of critical benchmark for when we would see crabgrass germination and would want to have our pre down. And you'll note in early February, kind of before the world broke and this pandemic went crazy, we had a period where we were above that line. And if you started your pre-program then in maybe a round 1, if you will, that probably wasn't going to make it throughout the duration of the year with all of the rainfall that we had. You know, typically we initiate our pre-emergence crabgrass research trials right around St. Patrick's Day, which in 2020 proved to be right about the time that we were seeing sustained soil temperatures above that line. I know a lot of you use April 1st as a trigger, right? So this year that might have been a shade late, but not too bad. The theme here, though, is that if you reacted to this early spring temperature flush, at least in Knoxville, it might have set you up for a situation for cleanups. And with that, you know, I think it's important, not knowing what 2021 will hold, to talk about what are the cleanup options out there for crabgrass, so you're prepared if we get into a situation where maybe 2021 plays out similarly, where we have a lot of summer rain and we see breakthrough. So if we look at these as a group, I've kind of captured several here to talk about. Herbicide by trade name in this column, and then this is the WSSA group number in this column here. You may wonder, well, why is that important? The group number is an indicator of mode of action, and as we see more cases of herbicide resistance, we want to make sure that we're mixing and diversifying our modes of action as much as we possibly can. And an easy way to do that is to mix or diversify our herbicide group numbers. So I think most listening are going to be familiar with Drive. Active ingredient is quinclorac. That is probably a standard bear for crabgrass control post-emergence, utility in warm season turf and in cool season turf. Solitaire, this is an FMC product, and they have taken Drive and added sulfentrazone to it, which is the active ingredient in Dismiss. So the idea with this is now we can pick up crabgrass as well, maybe some sedges or Kyllinga, which Greg is going to talk more about in his presentation, with a single app. Q4 Plus is going to have quinclorac and sulfentrazone, as well as some auxin herbicides to go with it. The idea there is let's make crabgrass control a part of what we do with a single app. Let's have some sedge control from that sulfentrazone inclusion, and then widen the spectrum even further to try to pick up more broadleaf weeds by putting in additional auxins. One of the things that you should note, though, is that the loads of quinclorac and sulfentrazone in Q4, particularly the sulfentrazone load, is lower than what we see in other products. So it can be a little bit erratic when it comes to sustained sedge and Kyllinga control, particularly in situations of heavy infestation. Lawn care wise, we don't have an option for MSMA anymore, nor do we in sports turf, but other sectors of the industry can use this as a post crabgrass herbicide. There is utility in cool season turf. Neither Greg nor I really are all that comfortable with that. We'd position this more as a warm season only product that's going to require sequential applications for sustained control. Now, Pyrex and Tenacity, they generate a lot of buzz in the lawn care industry. Both of those are group 27 HPPD inhibitors, so bleaching herbicides that turn weeds white. In a slide here, I'm going to give you some comparisons between Pyrex and Tenacity in terms of overall spectrum. From a crabgrass standpoint, these are going to be multiple application products. None of them are going to be single app, take out crabgrass from any lawn. If you have a mixture of crabgrass and goosegrass, would push you more towards the Pyrex side based on our data. There's going to be more goosegrass activity from the Pyrex herbicide than it would you'd find from a Tenacity treatment. Both of these have some utility around seeding, and I'm sure that Tom and Larry in their establishment talk this morning may talk about herbicide options when seeding and trying to establish new tall fescue. Acclaim Extra, this is going to be a cool season only product for post-emergence grass control. Would be a good option. It's a group 1 ACCase inhibitor for crabgrass control. And then we have a newer product here, Manuscript. This is a warm season only herbicide, or really a fit for Bermuda grass at this point. Crabgrass control in Bermuda grass post. If you are using Manuscript in warm season turf, we would advise you to use the spot treatment label recommendations for control. There's broadcast rates on the label in spot treatments, and in our trials, we've had far greater success with the spot treatment recs. So here's that comparison of Pyrex versus Tenacity. I'm not going to talk a lot about Bermuda grass control in this presentation. We can save that for Q&A, Bermuda grass control and tall fescue. But certainly, if you're going to use a bleacher in one of those programs, we would push you towards Pyrex over Tenacity in mixture, and you're going to want to have turf lawn in the tank as well. Tenacity is going to be one. We don't deal with this too much in Tennessee, but if we were trying to remove bent grass from tall fescue lawns, this would be one of our only actives that can do that. I mentioned that Pyrex is really good on goosegrass, probably better than Tenacity would be. I don't think zoysia grass infestations are going to be an issue. Both of these have activity on zoysia for zoysia removal. If you were managing a zoysia lawn, we wouldn't want you to use either herbicide, Pyrex or Tenacity in zoysia grass. You'd see some injury there. Overall, Tenacity is probably safer to more grasses when we think about its overall label spectrum. It has some activity on nutsedge. I wouldn't call it a standalone nutsedge product. It has some activity for POA annua control in cool season turf. Again, I wouldn't say it's a standalone. It does a lot better in mixtures, but when we compare it to Pyrex, it would separate itself a little bit more on that end. Both of these, as I mentioned, have utility around seeding. They're going to be fairly similar. I wouldn't call any of them a really strong broadleaf herbicide. They're probably similar performance on broadleaf weeds, fairly similar in our trial work on crabgrass, and then both would be an option for nimble-will control in tall fescue lawns. They're really two of our better actives for targeting that species. Segueing out of crabgrass a little, we'll talk goosegrass. This is another annual weed. We see it in warm season and cool season turfgrass. We really see it when we have fluctuating conditions of day and night temperature. The research will say really hot in the day and temperatures pushing 70 at nighttime. One of the reasons this is such a big issue is plants can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds, and this has led it to be classified as one of the 10 worst weeds globally. To target goosegrass, pre-herbicides are going to be a good choice, and we typically see this. We're working on an Emergence model in collaboration with Rutgers University. Right now, our best guidance is to think about goosegrass germination to be about 6 to 8 weeks after when we would see crabgrass germination. So we structure sequential applications of pre-emergence herbicides kind of on that metric, with the latter application positioned towards goosegrass. So if we look at all the residual grass control herbicides we have labeled in turf, and you can see them here on the screen, if I think about options for tall fescue lawns, which I've highlighted here in green, barricade, pendulum, dimension, and echelon, these are all going to have labeling for goosegrass control, all going to be fairly similar from a goosegrass control standpoint. We have seen some resistance. These are all the same mode of action group for the most part as group 3 mitotic inhibitors. We've seen cases of prodiamine resistance in goosegrass, but these would be what you would want to have in that second application of the year. So that might be a round 2 or even a round 3, whatever you're putting out, say early to mid-May, one of these would be a good choice if you have sites where goosegrass is going to be a problem. And without a model to know when we expect to see this, you're really charged with scouting, and that's going to be key. I'd like to share with you some maybe some tools you could use to aid with scouting in 2021. One of those is knowing where to look. We see goosegrass in trafficked areas, and particularly trafficked areas that lack turf cover. We have some data in the research world to show that the lack of cover is actually a bigger driver for goosegrass infestation than soil compaction. So kind of know where to look from a traffic standpoint. I think in lawns, this can be an issue, but for those of you that might be managing public park spaces that saw more use in 2020, this might be a weed that you see more in 2021 with more traffic. There's more of a loss of turf cover and a potential for more goosegrass. You can look at the leaf tips as well. So I've highlighted here goosegrass on the left and crabgrass on the right. You can see the leaf tip on crabgrass. It's going to be a little bit more pointed in this juvenile stage than what we see as a more rounded leaf tip in goosegrass. If we have an individual plant, another characteristic that I like to use, the sheaths of goosegrass tend to be fairly compressed and flattened, and they almost have like a white whitish, silverish sheen to them at this seedling stage. Now, one of the things that this is really picking up in the golf market, but I can see this being relevant in lawn care as well. If we are going to put out herbicides on actively growing green turf, some of these are going to be on need to go on a granular carrier only. In the golf market, for example, a lot of golf courses like to use oxadiazone for goosegrass control, and that is a herbicide that is injurious to actively growing turf. So what they do is they'll apply this on a granular carrier and try to do it in a way where it minimizes turfgrass injury. Well, in lawn care, we make a lot of applications on granular carriers, and I think that there are some kind of macro level lessons here that can be helpful when trying to get the best performance out of a granular herbicide application, particularly a pre-emergence product targeting something like goosegrass. And one of those real key lessons is to put some time and intention into selecting the right granular carrier. What I mean by that is not all granular carriers are created equal. And what we want when we are making a granular application of Dimension or Barricade or whatever product is we want to have really good coverage. So to do that, what we're looking for is a small particle, and particle size is rated by size guide number, SGN. So what we really like to see you lean on is granular products that are a low SGN, so a small particle that have a low AI percentage. So we don't have a lot of herbicide on each individual prill. Because if we want to get to a target rate, so if I'm trying to apply 3/4 of a pound of prodiamine per acre, well, if I have really small particles that don't have a lot of active ingredient on it, it's going to take me a lot of particles per unit area to get to that target rate. If I have really big particles that have a lot of active ingredient on it, it's not going to take me very many particles to get to that target rate. So the idea is let's try to maximize our coverage with product selection. Another key here is we want to make sure that we're putting this out on a lawn when we don't have a lot of dew present. We want to put it out to dry turf so that particle can fall through the turfgrass canopy and then can be watered in, whether it's from an irrigation system or for rainfall, to get into the soil where we want it to work. If you're going onto a lawn with a granular herbicide and it's 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning and there's dew all over your shoes, and then you're walking behind a rotary spreader spreading a pre, well, those particles are going to stick to the leaves and the dew, and that's not positioning them to be in the profile in an area where they're going to be set up to do what you want them to do. From a post standpoint, if you have sites that kind of are scouting like you might see goosegrass, the key is to act early. Smaller plants are going to be far easier to control than larger plants. Post-emergence options-wise, we've got several in warm season turf that you can see on the left-hand side. Aloxin is one that was used for a long time that's no longer manufactured. And you'll see Pyrex with the star there. There's some spot treatment label language for Pyrex in warm season situations. On the cool season side, are really things to lean on. Pyrex, as mentioned, is going to be a really good option for goosegrass control in tall fescue lawns. Acclaim Extra is going to be another option for goosegrass control in tall fescue lawns. And then Speed Zone is really interesting. So Speed Zone would be, this is the red label product. Historically, this has been leaned on as a broadleaf weed control herbicide. It's a mixture of carfentrazone with 3 auxins to go with it. And we think about that as a tool for broad spectrum control of broadleaf weeds like clover and dandelion and things like that. Well, there is labeling for goosegrass control, and our lab has worked with this for several years in field trials, and we've seen at the high label rate applied sequentially, this can do a really good job. And one of the things I want to make note of is that you may be in a situation where you're managing lawns that are multiple species. Maybe you have a lawn that's zoysia grass in the front and tall fescue in the back, or Bermuda grass in the front and tall fescue in the back, or vice versa. Speed zone is labeled for both warm and cool season turf, so it gives you the ability to go over both species interchangeably without a rate change. And no matter what you choose, we want to see you set these up for success. I've shown this slide before. We recently published a paper on this work in a journal that's a subsidiary of Nature called Scientific Reports. And we learned that it doesn't matter what goosegrass herbicide you pick. If you're putting this out on a lawn and the soil is really dry, it's not going to work very well. You know, this is an experiment we did several years ago. We put out all these premier herbicides at really high rates on goosegrass growing in soil that was less than 12% volumetric moisture content, and none of them gave us greater than 25% control. We put it out in a well-watered situation, soils greater than 20% volumetric, and these are performing the way that we want them to perform by and large. So we've learned that that moisture at application is really important. Now, for you, particularly in lawn care, you may not have the opportunity to manipulate this, right? What if it's a home that doesn't have an irrigation system? Well, I think that this is a point of communication that can be made, that, you know, if that homeowner is paying you to come in there and manage that lawn, and they have goosegrass issues, and it's August, and it hasn't rained in 3 weeks, and you're kicking dust up as you're walking out to your truck in the morning, well, that's kind of a waste of their money to go in and spray one of these premier actives, right? Because it's not positioning it to be successful. You'd be better suited to wait, maybe come in after we have some rainfall, there's moisture in the soil, and make your application at that time. And the concept here is really simple. You know, what we need for these herbicides to work well is we need moisture in the soil, so a pool of moisture in the soil, and then we need conditions for what's called transpiration, for the plant to access this moisture in the soil and transpire it into the atmosphere. This is essentially water movement upwards. If we can check all of those boxes, our goosegrass herbicides are going to do what we want them to do. If we don't check one of those boxes, they're not going to do what we want them to do. So if it's summer and we have really hot weather and the plant's trying to pull moisture out of the soil, but there's no moisture to be had, that's a situation where these products are probably going to fail. Now, I talked about Roughstock bluegrass in the intro, and I want to touch on it again here. This is a perennial grassy weed that forms patches in tall fescue lawns. It's really poor from a heat, drought, traffic, and disease standpoint. It pretty much melts away in our climate in the summer and returns in the fall when conditions are more favorable. It has a folded leaf formation, a membranous pointed ligule, and far greater than Kentucky bluegrass. And we often see this as a contaminant in tall fescue seed. And we have really minimal options for selective control. Current best practice is, if you're managing lawns with Poatrivialis problems, to spot treat with glyphosate and reseed into the void that is remaining. We looked at this in collaboration with NC State in 2020, and this trial is still ongoing because neither Greg nor I would make any conclusions about Poatrivialis control with only 5 or 6 weeks of data. But we made these applications in April. So these were made in Knoxville, April 1st and April 28th. And we came in, we rated these 42 days later, and we looked at a number of different things. This was all really structured around Progress, which is ethofumizate at a really high rate, 5.3 quarts per acre. We had mixtures of Progress plus terflon ester, Progress plus Tower, Exonerate plus Tenacity, Tower alone, Progress alone, Exonerate alone, and then Turf Lawn. And I share this with you just to say that there's some leads here. Sequential applications of Exonerate, for example, 9 ounces per acre applied twice. Top statistical category, 85, 90% Poa trivialis control, albeit short term. We'll see what this, if this holds true when these plots are rated again in the spring, but a promising lead. If we look at Progress plus Turf Lawn and then Exonerate plus Tenacity, they're in the same grouping, right? As is Progress plus Tower. But there's consequences for this. So, Exonerate 9 ounces does fairly well in this trial on Poa trivialis. We can see some injury, right? So this is a tall fescue stand. This is maintained at lawn height, so an optimal lawn height, so a 5-inch height of cut, trying to do everything we can to have the healthiest tall fescue. These are pictures from the day of rating control, right? So this Exonerate Tenacity treatment, it gave us really good Roughstock bluegrass control, but we see a little bit of a ding on the tall fescue. I don't think you would want to blanket spray a tall fescue lawn with that treatment. If you look at Exonerate, 2 apps, again, a little bit of a ding on that tall fescue. Now, these plants recovered and grew out of this, but it's just something you need to know that if we're trying to control a difficult perennial like Roughstock bluegrass, there may need to be some acceptance for injury. And then this is the Progress treatment, 5.3 quarts applied twice, probably the safest of the grouping. Finishing up real quick, I want to touch on little barley. This is a winter annual grassy weed. It's really similar in appearance to yellow foxtail, but has a different life cycle. So yellow foxtail is an annual grass that germinates in the spring, and then we see that distinctive inflorescence late in summer and early fall. Little barley is a grassy weed that germinates in the fall and will show this distinctive inflorescence in early spring. So we'll be visited by our friend little barley here soon. It has a really erect growth habit. It grows to 3/4 to 1.5 inches in height. It's fairly pale green in color. It doesn't have any hairs on the leaves or sheaths. And as mentioned, it has a distinctive seed head. We see it in dry soils, and really we see it's a sign for just weak turfgrass growing conditions, where some cultural modifications to grow healthier turf may be able to help us in our challenges with little barley. We don't have a whole lot of control options for this weed. Pre-emergence options, dithiopyr, which is sold as Dimension, or dithiopyr plus isoxaben, which is a newer product, sold as Crew. That does have little barley on the label. So if you have sites that you manage with this as a problem weed, you've been using something like Barricade, for example, you might want to rotate into a dithiopyr-based residual program. Post-emergence options, fluazafop has volunteer barley on the label. So this is going to be a different species, same genus. So something you could consider if you have a really bad infestation and you're looking for a cleanup from a home lawn standpoint. You would want to use Ornamec. That's the fluazafop product labeled for home lawns. And be aware that this is something that we would only want to have applied when we have really optimal tall fescue growing weather. We don't want to see this go out when the tall fescue is under any type of summer stress. Sulfosulfuron sold as Certainty. This would be a warm season product only that does have little barley on the label. I'm going to stop there in terms of technical. I just want to let you know really quickly, our mobile weed manual app that many of you have used. We are in the process of putting together a new and improved version 2.0. We usually launch the yearly update in January. It's going to be a little bit delayed this year because we're really changing the entirety of the user interface. So that will be updated later on in the spring. And Greg and I are really excited about the changes that you'll see there. If you participated in our Turf Tuesdays program in 2020, online webinars for pesticide points on the first Tuesday of every month. These will continue in 2021, and we're going to run April through October, the first Tuesday of the month. Same time, same station, same pesticide point opportunities. So you'll see a lot of communication about those as we get deeper into the spring. I would like to thank my team. You know, I'm lucky to have a great group of individuals to work with. Greg, who I've worked with for many years, runs our field operations. Javier Vargas, who you know on the bottom here, runs our laboratory and greenhouse endeavors. And then I've got 3 great graduate students right now, Devin Carroll, Dallas Taylor, and Ben Pritchard. And they work really hard on a diversity of projects, many that you've seen today. So thanks to them for their efforts as well. And I'm going to stop right here. This is my Twitter and email address for those of you who don't already have it. And I'm gonna pause, knowing there's some things I didn't touch on. I didn't touch on Bermuda grass control and tall fescue. I didn't touch on Dallas grass control. I got questions this year about signal grass control in lawns. We can touch on these in Q&A. And I think, Tom, I'll leave it here. Do you want to co-host over to Greg and he can share his screen?
Yeah, thank you very much. We have plenty of time for questions here. This is good timing. I think I've taken you off spot.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Brosnan.
Yeah,
so one question did come in the chat box. I need a good grass seed for the shady Holston Hills area. I'm at about 80% shade.
So 80% shade is going to challenge any grass. So I think the first thing there is expectation management. You know, I've heard it said that we don't see a whole lot of grass in the forest. So, you know, we need to be wary of that it's not a realistic expectation to have this beautiful sward of whatever species you want to plant under 80% shade. So I think reevaluating the landscape would be important because all of our grasses have limits and we need light in order to grow turf. And I would say that, you know, a blend of tall fescues with fine fescues would be something that we would have you lean on, and probably heavier on the fine fescue end of things for shaded conditions. I don't think that blend's going to do all that well in 80% shade. So again, that gets back to the expectation management piece. But I would look for blends that are heavier on the fine fescue side. I see in here, I thought about changing to moss. That's probably, you know, it's probably a realistic thought at this point. Question came in, is Progress at 5.3 quarts per acre expensive? I don't know. I would venture probably that's an awful high rate for that active ingredient. So you'd be at the uppermost end of the labeled rate range. I know that Exonerate, one of the other actives that did really well in that test, even on the golf course side, is one of our pricier actives. And I think keep in mind that those treatments on Roughstock bluegrass, they probably set up best for spot application. So, you know, you might make an investment into that product and think, well, I'm managing 50 acres of lawns across East Tennessee. I can't afford to do that. Well, you don't have 50 acres of Roughstock bluegrass. You have spots of Roughstock bluegrass within that 50 acres. So the investment in a higher end chemistry applied at a spot treatment might be worth it for you, given the clientele that you have and their expectation. Question here about recommendations for Dallas grass control pre and post. So we don't really talk much about Dallas grass control pre because most of our Dallas grass in Tennessee persists from rhizomes. So it overwinters from underground rhizome tissue. We have products that have pre-Dallas grass labeling, but what that speaks to is Dallas grass establishment from seed, which can happen, but is not all that common. What we see most is Dallas grass persistence and spread from vegetative tissue. So if you're managing Dallas grass and you have heavy infestation, post options are going to be limited in cool season turf. Fluazephat based programs have done well, particularly applied in the fall. We like to recommend at least 2 fall apps and then 1 spring cleanup before we get into weather where tall fescue struggles. We've done some testing, and Greg was really creative in putting together a spot treatment program that was pretty heavy on Pyrex a few years ago, and we did see success with high rate spot treatments of Pyrex. But again, there's price point issues there. There's logical issues. There's going to be an acceptance for potential off-target injury. If that's, you were to put a high concentration Pyrex mixture on a desirable tall fescue, you'd certainly see some bleaching. On the warm season side, most of your sulfonylureas, tribute totals, probably the go-to. Right now, we've seen success with Monument applied as a spot treatment as well. All of those, we recommend spot treatment applications. Manuscript on the warm season side has been one that's been marketed as a Dallas grass control option. We've done a lot of testing with it, and we see it be additive. So it's a nice addition to a tribute total or a Monument spot treatment program. But as a standalone, we haven't seen great results with it in our trial work. On Dallas grass, the one thing I'd consider you to think about is that, with all these herbicides that we talk about, and they all have their own unique price points, you're paying for selectivity. And what you need to consider is, if I have a lawn that's 50 or 60 or 70% Dallas grass, is it worth the investment to save the other 40% of turf that's there, right? Because you're going to cross over this threshold where there might be so much Dallas grass, it's not worth paying for the selectivity to save the 20 or 30% turf cover that's left. It might be more economical to just completely renovate and go with a complete renovation and establish a new lawn if you have these hard to control perennials that are going to require multiple applications of selective herbicide. That's not a decision that anyone in extension can make for you. It's probably a conversation between you and the property owner, but it's a conversation that's worth having. I see.
And Jim, I think on that point, all of our programs in Dallas grass involve, the most successful ones involve seeding into that.
That's exactly right. Great point.
Even the selective ones, you need to make sure there's some seeding going on in those tall fescue areas, and then get back on the pre part, stay on a good pre program, something like you would be doing for goose grass control.
And the seeding is also important when we talk about Bermuda grass control in tall fescue also. You could be on a premier Pyrex turf lawn program or Fluazephat turf lawn program or a claim turf lawn program. In all of our trial work shows, if you don't come back in with new tall fescue seed and introduce plant competition, you're just going to manage more Bermuda grass eventually. So that's a pretty key piece to add into the matrix. See a question here. What is the best grass for backyards that have dogs and kids that play? I don't know that there's any unique, like, this is the best grass that matches that use pattern. I would think that that's a scenario for high traffic. So when we think about traffic tolerance, I would be more inclined to go with Bermuda grass or as a traffic tolerant turf. When you think about the grasses that are in high traffic spaces, soccer fields, football fields, things like that, they tend to be warm season species. They also have probably a higher recuperative potential than a cool season turf. But there's a trade-off, at this time of year, you're gonna have dormant turf, and you have to be comfortable with a dormant turf situation. But there's a case to be made when the kids and the dogs are out playing in the yard. That's when the grass is green and the Bermuda grass is actively growing. So There's no perfect match for that use pattern, but selecting grasses based on traffic tolerance probably makes good sense.
And there was a question just before that was about what type of grass for shade. And I think that's a ongoing question. I don't think we've ever found anything that's really great for shade.
No, I mean, you know well, Tom, that sunlight's pretty important for photosynthesis, no matter what we're growing, right?
That's for sure. Everyone wants that, but we just tell them to stay tuned to the ornamental talks. Maybe we'll have something short.
Turf paint on Bermuda. I can't really speak to that from an experience standpoint, other than I know that it's done, and I know that the golf courses in particularly that do this time of year for winter color have had really good success with that. And there's a lot of different options out there from many different vendors of products to do that, to give the illusion of green when the grass is dormant.
Jim, I can take that one if you'd like, or add a little bit to that.
Go for it.
If you're in the Knoxville area, I would recommend that you check with the group that I used to know as Lesco, and then it was John Deere Landscapes, and now it's what is it called? It's on North Wise Harbor Road, Jim.
Like Site One, Tom.
Site One, yes, Site One. They've got an excellent colorant. Believe it or not, it's used quite often for sports fields, particularly baseball and football. They have several different colorants. One type of colorant is a dye, and it's pretty much just used to fool a television camera. Okay, so it doesn't last very long, but from afar, it looks really good, and we use it quite a bit at NFL and MLB level. But what I would suggest, if you want a more persistent color, is look into a pigment. And many of the pigments are basically, they're basically pigments like the plant will produce itself. So it's not like you're going to get a phytotoxic browning response, and actually the use of these pigments can, in the fall, can actually extend the growing season of the warm season turf a little bit. So I would encourage you to just check with one of your vendors that you really respect. There are many products out there, but I'm more familiar with the old Lesco line. And one thing I would encourage you to do, though, if you're dealing with Bermuda grass and you're trying to improve the color, don't put all your eggs in one basket in terms of one application. Years ago, I worked with Bobby Campbell when he was managing the sports fields here at UT. And what Bobby found was you can color the thatch. So actually what he did, he would start out with a half the recommended rate while the Bermuda grass was still actively growing. And that then, as the turf grass continued to lose rate of growth, the thatch would become colored. And then the second app he would make would be at about full rate. So, and it performed very well for him, and in many cases lasted well into the following spring. So, so it just depends on what your goal is. If I had a wedding that I was going to host on a turf in the warm season turf in the fall, I would use a dye, and you'd be surprised. Many of these dyes do mimic the green coloration of the tall fescue. It's not really a deep green like you would see on bluegrass, but I remember years ago in Stillwater, Oklahoma, many of the lawn care companies that were treating with pre-emergence herbicide, Jim, you'll get a kick out of this. They were treating with pre-emergence herbicides, and in an effort to enhance their marketing and their letting people know that they're in the neighborhood, they would actually use a pink dye. And so you'd go out into these suburban areas near Stillwater, Oklahoma, and you'd find these pink lawns. And the pink color would last about 5 weeks in the spring. And then some of the earlier green colors were actually more along the lines of an aqua or a deeper blue. And they were totally artificial. It made Boise State's blue field look, it paralleled that. So, we've learned a lot about dyes and pigments, but again, just think about how long you want to enhance the color. And the pigments will definitely cost more than the dyes, but they will also deliver long-term results. Hope that helps. Oh, and the other thing is, don't be afraid to reduce your pressure. Take out your screens when you apply these, if you're doing it, with a boom sprayer, and just get ready to get a pair of tennis shoes after you use them. Just throw those, you need to throw those in the recycle bin, because these pigments do stain your tennis shoes.
Well, and I would think that that's a real issue in a landscape too, because you wouldn't want to get this on a driveway or a walkway. Or
Yes.
Because it will be.
Apply the product where you want it to go.
A precision application.
Okay, well, the reality is the green coloration seems to provide some insulation, and I think what you're doing, you're actually carrying a warmer canopy temperature as a result of the colorant use. The other thing that I've noticed is, I'm going to go back though, Greg, and I want to talk a little bit about the shade question. We use in the commercial turf situation, sometimes particularly in golf course settings, the application of a product like Primo can enhance the performance of some species of turf grasses in shade. So we see it used more, I think, on warm season turfs in shade, but the application of a plant growth regulator like Primo, it basically decelerates the rate of vertical growth of the turf, so that, in limited light, what may actually happen is it allows the plant to partition energy below ground and reduce the amount of energy that is utilized due to the shoot growth. So you may see in some situations, I know got a really good comment from Ben about using colorants, but those of you that are managing shaded landscapes, what you might, and I'm not going to encourage you to do it on a wholesale level, but you might want to not only look at the application of colorants, but look at the application perhaps of a plant growth regulator like Primo, and just see for yourself if it could possibly improve the appearance of that turf in shade. Most homeowners would probably not find that something of interest, because I don't know that the Primo would be available in small quantities. But if you're a professional landscaper and you've got several lawns that you're managing and you just want to take a look at that, I would encourage you to look at that, and you may or may not find it beneficial.
I'm going to introduce Mr. Greg Breeden. He's also with the University of Tennessee. He's a weed science extension assistant since 1996. So boy, the consistency of our turfgrass program is really fallen on him and Jim and some of those others up there with the weed science. He's responsible for managing all the turfgrass weed science research projects at UT. And I've been up there to some of those turf days, and I'm sure a lot of you have too, and seen what a great job they do to get that going. They work with the development of new turfgrass, weed science, extension, and educational materials, including the mobile weed manual. He has his master's degree in plant and soil science at the University of Tennessee. And welcome, Greg Breeden.
Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. Those that have seen me speak in the past, I'm not real good about standing behind a podium. I kind of move around a little bit, so today won't be any easier for me sitting in front of the screen here. So bear with me. I'll do the best I can to be still and not be waving my arms and stuff going on. But I really enjoyed that last little bit of that question and answer and discussion, and there'll be plenty of time at the end of this for even more of that, because that's one of the things with me and Jim, we talked about what we were going to try to cover, and we thought if me and him and even Tom and maybe Larry, if he's got some time at the end when I get done, we could all kick around some question and answer again for everybody, because there's going to be quite a bit of time when I get done. As far as my presentation, I know I was supposed to cover broadleaf some. I didn't put anything really in there about broadleaf specific because I didn't really see a lot of new things on the market this year or new ways. We still had the same problem weeds, Virginia buttonweed. If you've been to the field day, the last time we had one, and maybe even some of our discussion, you'll see us talk a lot about programs, those program approaches where you're putting down freeze and coming back with post. That's really the silver bullets, I guess, if you will, if there is anything for Virginia buttonweed. It's multiple applications of herbicides and trying to look at that season-long approach for that one. I know that's one we see all the time and get a lot of questions about. Wild violet's another one. Again, multiple applications of herbicides. There's no real silver bullets out there for wild violet. And in fact, for me, it has become probably as a hard, most difficult to control weeds is probably even jumped Virginia buttonweed. Wild violet is very difficult to control. And I think some of that has to do with the shady areas that it often creeps into the areas in. But 2-3 applications, we've had good success with products like Escalade 2, Momentum 4-score, and you're looking at some of those products that have fluroxapirs and triclopirs and things like that in it, but definitely very difficult to control broadleaf weed. Get a lot of questions about it. The top 4, that's 2. Ground ivy is another one. It's a little easier to control than those first 2, but again, it really likes creeping in from those shady areas. Similar products as wild violet. A lot of those 3- and 4-way mixtures do a decent job on ground ivy, but a lot of times it is not only a single application, but a multiple application to take care of it. And one that's really interesting to me is white clover. It is crazy how many herbicides that we have that we can control white clover with, but it just continues to be a problem every year and wherever we go. And I don't know if some of that has to do with maybe some of the fertility, because some of our fertility products have gotten expensive and trying to maybe share a little bit of money or save a little money there. But man, clover just does not go away. Every year we see those areas of clover with it. The one new herbicide that you'll see out there's not really a new herbicide. Jim's already talked about it a little bit and is alluding to it in the Goosegrass control section. It's Speed Zone, and it's that red label product. It's a new formulation. They've switched from the EC to the EW, so you'll probably see that this year more so in the past. So it's going to be an EW formulation from that old EC, which is more of a oil-based type, and where the EW is not. Expects similar or the same results from those two. The work we've done side by side, they look a lot alike and do the same things when it comes to the weed spectrum on those. And again, there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers and stuff and discussion at the end. We can bring Jim and Tom and everybody back in if they want to on it. The main ones I want to focus on today are going to be the sedges and the Kyllingas. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about those. Everybody's familiar with yellow nutsedge. It's the one every time I try to leave that one out of an extension talk or any talk presentation I give. There's a question about it at the end. And it continues to be a problem. It likes wetter areas, has those triangular stems. Probably our most common, particularly in a lawn care setting, is the yellow nutsedge that we have. It just won't go away. Next of kin to it would be the purple nutsedge. We don't see as much of this one, but it's a little more difficult to control than yellow nutsedge. We probably see this a little more down towards Tom Stebbins' area for whatever reason, more in the southern sections of Tennessee. I get more questions and comments about it down that way. I'm not sure why that would be. But anyway, we try to see it down in those southern areas. Very similar. They both form nutlets is how they reproduce. The purple nutsedge, the nutlets tend to be connected, where they don't necessarily do with yellow nutsedge. And the purple nutsedge, you can kind of see there and on my screen, it's got more of a purplish seed head, whereas the yellow nutsedge, it's more of a yellowish color seed head. And purple nutsedge, the leaf is a little more blunt on it, whereas the yellows tends to be a little more pointy. And the purple nutsedge has a darker green color, but that's, unless you have them side by side, that's often hard to tell. And depending on fertility levels, it doesn't always show as well. Kyllinga species, I would imagine, and we could even 10 to 15 years ago, I didn't see hardly any of these Kyllingas. We primarily have false green Kyllinga in our state. There is some green, but it's primarily false green. It has really taken off in our turf areas, and I see more and more of it. And actually, I see more Kyllinga species in my travel than I do the sedges anymore, particularly once we get into those hotter months of the summer. It's like it kind of transitions from a sedge into those Kyllingas, but probably the hardest of the three to form. It's more rhizomatous, if you will. It produces by rhizomes, and it really forms patchy, dense patchy areas in the turf with it. But I see more and more of those. I would have ventured 15 years ago, it would have been hard for me to find a site to do research for Kyllinga. And now I have way more sites that I can just go do a research trial on Kyllinga, probably more for those than I do the actual sedges. So if you've been having trouble with controlling your sedges, you might want to double check to make sure it is a sedge and not a Kyllinga, because they are a little more difficult to control. It's a little bit smaller of a plant, very similar. You can see the seed heads is more of a globe shape, but if it's false green, you don't get to see those until the fall of the year. Similar color to our sedges, but it's definitely become more of a problem. So there's the three of those. And I would say for us, those three different species are going to take up most of what sedges we have to deal with. There's some others out there, but those are going to be the primary ones, particularly when you look at yellow nutsedge, purple nutsedge, and false green Kyllinga. That's the main ones we see in our area. And again, some green Kyllinga, but they're very similar. What do they all have in common? They're all devoid of arcles, collars, ligules, and pubescence. Those are all types of things that you'll see on a grass plant, which these are not grasses. You can see the picture there, the triangular stem. They all have that, and it either comes from a tuber or a rhizome. Those stems do. You can see the plant there. They can produce, one plant can produce up to 550 tubers if left undisturbed, and that's a lot when you think about below ground structures of a plant. So, and one tuber can produce 1,900 plants and another 6,900 additional tubers. And that's all from some work Summerlin and you guys did in the weed science area a number of years ago. But that's, you think about one season left uncontrolled, what those plants could do reproducing. And much like what I mentioned with Virginia buttonweed, success here doesn't equal one application with these. We're looking at multiple applications. Program approaches really help with those, and you can see how unsightly sometimes they can be in a turf situation with that yellowish against the nice fescue green color there. But again, multiple applications a lot of times in those areas, particularly if we have problem areas with those. I saw this the other day, Jim showing this, and I thought this was real interesting. The tubers can be viable for 3 years when there's moisture there. So if you have moisture, those tubers can be there for 3 years. But if it's dry, only a few days, several days, and those tubers might not be viable anymore. So you think about where you find these plants most of the time, that makes for a lot of sense, but I never really thought about it in those terms. And this was some work done in '87, but those just within several days there, when it's dry, the tubers can no longer be viable. But we find these in wet areas, particularly the LCO market. Folks get those new irrigation systems and they want to run them, sometimes too much. You'll see sometimes they're going off when it's raining and things along those lines. So that would be a key point, maybe things to talk to homeowners to turn those irrigation systems back, or even fix areas that hold moisture, and just to get that area to dry up can go a long ways. I kind of already mentioned this, but we'll go over it again. The yellow nutsedge, that's a perennial plant, and it comes from a nutlet, as you can see down in the picture there. The purple nutsedge is, again, nutlets as well, perennial plant, but a lot of times the nutlets on the purple nutsedge will be connected to form like a network of them, if you will. And the Kyllinga species are more rhizomes. As you can see in the lower right-hand picture there, you can see those dense mats it'll make, and it'll just take over turf areas. I've seen places where you would actually think that is the turf that you're looking at, and it is the Kyllinga species. But again, all those pretty difficult to control. I would think Kyllinga species the most, purple nutsedge would be second, and then yellow nutsedge would be the easiest of those three from a control standpoint. The three of the primary species you see around in the southeast in particular, green Kyllinga, those flowers during all months. It's a perennial with rhizomes. Originally for a long time, I thought what we had was mainly green Kyllinga, but as of late, it's all been false green Kyllinga. So, and that's the reason we figured that part out was because of that flowers only during the fall of the year. So our Kyllinga primarily flowers during the fall. So it's the false green Kyllinga. And again, you can see the note there. It's most common in the northern transition zone, which is where we're at in those areas. So again, tufted Kyllinga, this flowers during the fall. It's more of an annual with no rhizomes. I don't see a whole lot of that in our state. It's a little more as you go towards the south, a little something further south than we are. But all three of those are going to be your primary ones for the Kyllinga species. And again, just a shot of the green Kyllinga there. It's very similar. It's a little bit smaller of a plant. It can take intense mowing. So if you're in an area which you're managing, mowing multiple times a week, it can really take that pressure, whereas our sedges don't take that mowing pressure as well as the Kyllinga species. But you can see the rhizomes from that plant and the lack of nutlets from the Kyllinga species. I already mentioned that they can tolerate the mowing, particularly low mowing heights. We find it on golf putting greens where you're less than 0.2 inches on those, whereas most sedge species cannot take those mowing heights and the frequency of those. So Kyllinga can really take that mowing. In Bermuda grass, when you mow it at an inch, it can increase the Kyllinga infestation from when you compare that to mowing at 2 inches. And we saw this with other work we've done. This was someone else's work here, but we've done some work with crabgrass and things, whereas the higher you mow, the better weed control you have just from the mowing standpoint. So you decrease your weed populations when you can increase that mowing height. So anytime you can do something along those lines to help that turf outcompete weeds, it's always a good thing to do. And there, as Summerlin and some of the others found there, regular mowing can suppress nutsedge growth and improves herbicide efficacy in those. So again, just another point that the sedges can't take that mowing, whereas the those Kyllinga species can. You know, and here's you can see we have a number of herbicides that are effective on the Kyllinga sedges and Kyllinga species. You can see that list there: Certainty, sulfuron, Dismiss NXT, which is the new formulation of Dismiss, and it's a mixture of sulfentrazone and carfentrazone. If you're used to the Dismiss NXT is going to show similar results with those. Dismiss South is the mazathipir and sulfentrazone. Katana, flazosulfuron, Monument, trifloxysulfuron, Sedge, halosulfuron. Tribute Total is a mixture of thiacarbazone, 4-amsulfuron, halosulfuron. Solero and mazasulfuron, and then Vexus pyrimesulfan is a relatively new sedge product that just come out. It's kind of in like a shaker jar, if you will, where you can kind of spot treat those sedges and Kyllingas with those. The one thing to note on this is when you look at the groupings of those products, they're almost all in the same categories. We only have most of those are in the sulfosulfurons, as you see the end there. So it's really hard to do a rotation of herbicides to help keep from having resistance issues with those. They all pretty much fall under that same categories. Okay. And thus, we've already saw in Georgia an ALS resistant annual sedge that's been confirmed in turfgrass, and the ALS resistance is to halosulfuron, which is sedge hammer, but it's also resistance to those others, Monument, Certainty, and all of those. But that has been confirmed in Georgia, and it's an annual sedge that has been confirmed resistance in turfgrass at that point. So another one of those, if you've been having a lot of problems controlling yellow nut sedge and you've maybe used sedge hammer or halosulfuron, you might want to get us a sample here at the Weed Diagnostic Center and let us take a look at it and see if it is actually resistance or if there's something else going on there with that particular herbicide. But if you've used halosulfuron, sedge hammer for the last 10 years and not switched to a Dismiss every so often or a different herbicide mode of action, you might want to consider that as an option. Just a few slides on yellow nut sedge control. I've mentioned Solero in that list. If you've not heard of Solero just yet, it's new farm. It's been out a number of years now, but still relatively new to the sedge market. The active is a mazasulfuron, labeled for most grasses that we have in our state. The rate range is from 8 to 14 ounces, and it has sedge and Kyllinga control, and it's that group 2, so it'll fall under the same category of herbicides as sedge hammer and the Monument for the warm season grasses. But again, does a pretty good job. I like to see you at that higher rate range for whatever turf you have with it, but does a great job for control. The other one is Dismiss NXT. They changed the formulation there and added some carfentrazone to that, but again, does a good job. If you've been used to using the old dismiss, the rates are a little different, but you should expect rate for rate, very similar stuff to the dismiss that you'd been using in the past. So some work here we've done comparing those: Solero at 14 ounces, Dismiss at 12, Dismiss NXT at 15, and Dismiss NXT at 10 fluid ounces as you go down, lower rate of the NXT on the bottom. The one key when get asked about which product's better than the other, it's usually more about how fast. Do you want fast activity? Then if you do, you want to be using something with sulfentrazone in it, which would be a Dismiss product. That blue bar is 7 days after, so you can see within a week, you could see around 20% or so activity within a week. And by 14 days with those products, you're upwards around that 100% control with it. Whereas with the Solero, it took almost 2 weeks before you saw that 25% or so activity. But outwards of a month, you can see they all perform similar. They're all close to 100% control with those. So that's always, they all do a good job of sedge control. It's just how fast do you want to get there. And you look at the list, and Jim made note of this with some of the stuff earlier. When you go to a cool season grass, it really narrows down your options. So what I have highlighted there are your options for cool season. Tall fescue, essentially turf, Dismiss NXT, Sedgehammer, and Solero. Those are going to be your options if you're utilizing tall fescue turf for those. So, but for Bermuda grass and zoysia grass, there's a lot more options, I guess, just to say what I wanted to put with that particular slide. The false green Kyllinga, I got a little bit of data and some work that we've been doing here at UT, and also in collaboration with Dr. Elmer's crew up at Rutgers with it. So what we did in 2019 was we used growing degree days. You probably heard us talk about the growing degree days in the past. And what we've done with those was we started at 100 growing degree days and we'd put an application out. And then 150 growing degree days, this was, and then we went all the way out to the cooling degree days, which you've heard us talk about those as well, which is that pinkish looking bar on the far right. So this was in 2019. And we used products Dismiss NXT, Sedgehammer, and Solero on those. And you can see that with the green bars, we did a little better when we let the Kyllinga get a little further in the summer in 2019. But Matt and Dr. Elmore, and they started digging a little deeper into it, and they thought that maybe soil temperature correlated better with the data we had generated that year. And so we did another study this past year where we looked into the soil temperatures rather than growing degree days. And we tried to hit these target range for our application. The green bar is 60 to 65 degrees soil temperature. You see that application went out in around April 14th. And then the gray bar is 65 to 70. That was May 20s, late May. And then the purple bar, 70 to 75. That's early June. And then greater than 75 was a little later in June. We used Dismiss NXT and Sedgehammer for this particular study. Again, once we got a warmer soil temperature, we tended to get a little better control, particularly when we were at that 65 or better percent control with those. But so now I think we may look at this a little deeper this year again, but we think there's a little correlation there to let those soil temperatures get a little warmer when we're looking at the Kyllinga controls to get a little better activity with our herbicides. I often get questions, and you can see it on a few labels about, can you control these with pre-herbicides? And that's yellow nutsedge, purple, and the green and false green Kyllingas with those. So if you do a little searching, you can find these on the pre-herbicide labels of Echelon, Tower, Freehand, and the Pennant Magnum there on the bottom. The one thing that I will say about those particular herbicides, if you're going to go after pre-activity with these, you need to probably more look at that as a added benefit rather than pre's. We've talked a lot about these having nutlets and rhizomes where they're coming back from those. The pre-herbicides don't really have activity on those, but it might be able to weaken those a little bit, or at least keep the seeds from germinating with those. One thing that's been real popular, and I meant to look up to see if they did this again this year, is FMC actually had a guarantee with their Echelon product that if you put it out by a certain date, I don't know if that was in the LCO market, but I know they did it in golf for sedge control with it. But it's been real popular with some of the folks in golf. I know they moved Echelon into their round 2 of their pre's, and it'll help knock down any of the sedge or the Kyllinga species that are up there and growing with it, having that sulfentrazone part into that. So if you're really battling the Kyllinga, that might be something to consider, is make that your second round of your pre when it comes to those, because I know me and Jim both like to have 2 applications of pre-emergence herbicide if you really want to get season-long control of both crabgrass and goosegrass in our state. So you got your first one out by, say, March 15th, and then you come back about 6 to 8 weeks later with that second one. It might be worth considering an Echelon or something along those lines to get you some of that knockdown that you might have some sedges or Kyllingas already up there. But you're not going to see that true pre-activity like you see with crabgrass. Whereas if you get it out before those forsythias bloom, you're probably 95% better control with that. But you could look at these as a benefit if you're really going to go hard after Kyllingas or sedges, to maybe start with one of these that year. And if you wanted to look a little deeper into the nutsedge and the Kyllinga species, we have a fact sheet on our website. It's that extension Tennessee. It's on our Tennessee turfgrassweeds.org website. You can find it there. It's publication W260. We have it's totally dedicated to sedge and Kyllinga. Some of that information that we've heard today is on that fact sheet, and we have a number of other fact sheets on some of the stuff that Jim's discussed earlier, and broadleaf controls and things there that you can. You know, I always try to talk a little bit about preventative stuff, but that's important regardless of the weed species that you're going after, wherever environment, whether that's a landscape bed, the turf, or anything, or crop. You know, you want to do anything. Think about preventative weed control like this. So if you're doing things that weaken the desirable turf grass, that's going to encourage weeds in any of those areas. So you want to try to do everything to give the turf grass its best competitive advantage, because you can get a lot of weed control just from your turf grass, whether that's mowing it at the correct height. There's been numerous papers on that's showing just even from 1 inch difference in the mowing height of raising that height, you can really help a pre-emergence crabgrass herbicide out. Also will help just keep from weeds infesting those areas, and it'll keep those stands dense and competing against the weeds. And optimize those environmental plus the herbicides. Again, that's what I'm talking about there, is that integrate. You can see the weeds around that pipe and that ear. I'm not sure if that was a drain pipe or what, but it was just clogged up with weeds. If you're trying to get the moisture away from areas and your pipes are clogged, anything you can do to do that. Try traffic areas for things like goosegrass. Jim mentioned earlier. If there's any way you can move that traffic away from those areas, all of that's going to go a long ways into helping manage those weed populations. That's one in particular. I know I'm talking about the sedges, but the goosegrass, I've went to sites one year and come back the next to maybe try to put a trial out, and they've done some stuff to help fix the turf or do some seedings, and it can almost be impossible to find goosegrass when you've got a nice canopy of turf. Again, a little bit more preventive weed control things, just some stuff to think about. Look for certified seed that keeps those, you don't bringing in new weeds or tubers from sedges and things. Sod's the same way. You might want to inspect your sod, particularly if you're getting a really good deal on it. There may be a reason it's being moved. Maybe there is some weed issues there or something, but when you can, make sure it's free of weeds. Same thing with compost and topsoil. You can bring in stuff with those, your mulches. Anytime you can inspect those and just make sure that you're not bringing in weeds to a situation, particularly if you've done a really good job of managing those areas and you're relatively weed free. You don't want to bring in, a problem, particularly with that. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but irrigate such that it doesn't negatively affect your turf. You want to feed your turf, whether it's water or fertilize, what it needs, and just don't go overboard. I know a lot of folks want to run those. My wife's doctor, when we were having one of our kids, he told me how much money he was spending a month watering his lawn, and I was like, geez, you could probably resod every year, but if you added that up. But I didn't really get into that with him. He liked running his irrigation system, and he was very proud of it. So, but irrigation can be great. It makes a really nice lawn or area, but you can also go overboard with that irrigation as well. And I think that's a good point to keep in mind, particularly if you need to educate someone that may be overwatering an area. And again, this is all kind of just to stress, the integrated pest management, if you will. The herbicide or the pesticide component of those, that's just a small piece of the puzzle. If you have, particularly with sedges, if you've got a problem area that stays wet, weak turf, it's going to be hard for those herbicides. It's going to be an uphill battle for those when you don't have all those other pieces of the puzzle working together to make it go. But if you got them all right, it can help win those battles. Kind of to start wrapping up where I was at here, that Tennessee turfgrassweeds.org, it has a lot of those information. We have a lot of fact sheets on it. If you need those, you can print those fact sheets off and maybe give them to a homeowner if you're explaining trying to tell them about the weeds you're trying to control or what's going on. We have several fact sheets on there, and we try to keep those updated with the most up-to-date herbicides and stuff there. Jim's already mentioned this. I had this in there. We are really excited. This will be our first really big update and change to our mobile weed manual when it come about. Looks going to maybe look a little different, but hopefully it's going to be a lot faster. And we're going to try to keep it this web-based model that we've had, but we're fixing to really roll up our sleeves and get into updating this mobile weed manual and have it ready to roll for 2021. Really excited about that. We both mentioned this weed diagnostic center. Again, if you're having problems with weeds and your herbicides that you've used and normally worked well and don't anymore, you can send those in there and we'll test those for a small fee. And also just if you got a new weed or one you haven't saw or don't ID, you can send it in and we'll ID it there as well. That's the weeddiagnostics.org if anybody's looking for those. I'm on Twitter at GBreeden1, and Jim is also there at UT Turf Weeds. And if you look us up, we try to keep up-to-date information out when we're doing our travels and stuff we're seeing, particularly if it's getting close to crabgrass time and things like that, or if we're seeing way more sedges one year than we were the next year. And that's all I formally have. So if Jim and some folks want to come in, we can try to answer these. I saw there were some questions come in. I didn't really take the time to do much with those as we're going, but we can try to answer some questions.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask field days. Are you tentatively going to schedule something for the fall and see if it works, or any?
My understanding right now, and Jim can add to this, Tom, is the plan for the field day this year is to do those online, that Tennessee Turf Tuesdays he was talking about, because we're still kind of in a state that, of unknown, if you will, of what we can have get together and stuff. And Jim, if you want to add to that, you can.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, one of the big drivers of field day has always been the delivery of pesticide credits. And with now having a way to do that effectively online, and people don't have to take a day off from work, right? They can fit it into their normal work day. We're going to continue to do that. We're also we might not have the opportunity from the university to have large groups, but one of the things that we've talked about is to have like maybe one day a month in the summer where you can show up and go on a walking tour of the research center with me and Greg and get a pesticide credit for doing that. We've kind of played around with the name of calling it like Walk Through Wednesday or something. Have it be like the last Wednesday of every month. So there will definitely be ways to engage, but they're probably going to look different than they did pre-2020.
Gotcha. Yep. I know I've used the Weed ID program. Was that down for a while because I didn't see it, and then it came back up, and it seems to be better than ever?
Yeah, no, it was. We had a little issue. The company that we use for server space hosting for that because it's on an external server, we have a little bit more freedom to operate. Well, they went out of business due to COVID, so we had to find a new service provider, get it online, and it was really messy. So that was the reason for the delay. But we've crossed that bridge, and now we're back online and where we need to be.
And Tom, that's one of the things about the new mobile weed manual. I noticed you made a point there about you locked it, and appreciate that. But it should be a lot faster with the new server situation from what we're being told and understand, because the search features of it should run a lot smoother. We're cutting some things out and things like that with it.
I had a question in the chat here, Greg. Recommendations for broadleaf apps in colder weather. You want to?
Yeah, I'll tackle that. If you're thinking about getting on the broadleaf weeds right now, that's awesome, because with the winter annuals that are out there now, we've seen there's a lot of pressure this year with those winter annuals, whether that's chickweed, henbit, dead nettles in the areas I've been. I always like to see if you're going to go in the cooler temps to put something in there that has carfentrazone in there, or add some carfentrazone, which is quicksilver, to those 3- and 4-way mixtures in there. Speed Zone's a good option. I mentioned earlier it has that. Those tend to do a little better in the cooler weather. Now, I wouldn't be spraying this week knowing what the forecast holds. I would like to try to see it a little bit above freezing anyway. Those low temperatures, or at least staying just a few degrees above freezing before you put those apps out. But definitely get on those. The sooner the better. And like I said, when it's cooler, I like to see stuff with quicksilver in there. Anything to add to that, Jim?
No, I mean, I think that covers it. The quicksilver thing, as an addition to the traditional broadleaf mixtures, it's once you see it, it's pretty eye-opening. When you apply those products alone and then add quicksilver, the difference is night and day when we have colder air temperature. Also, if you're using on warm season grasses, the same messages are there about kind of knowing when to pull the trigger. Like if you were going to use Roundup in dormant Bermuda grass, you definitely don't want to be spraying on a day like today. You want to shoot for air temperatures 55 to 65, I'd say, as a good trigger. And one question we get every spring, and it comes a lot from the golf market, but it's true anywhere there's Bermuda grass is, if I go too late, am I going to slow green up of that warm season turf? And, you can dig down into a dormant Bermuda grass canopy and usually find a green stolon or rhizome in there as kind of proof of life when it's really cold. We've tested that, and we've tried to go really early on time and then like egregiously late, trying to hurt the Bermuda grass. And at the end of the day, even the timing that is way later than you would ever do it, we still get to full green up by the 1st of May. It just kind of slows the rate that we get there. So that's a useful application in a warm season scenario.
So there's something about, do we recommend Quicksilver with an ethyl product or an amine product? I think what I always used to use when I did more forage work was we always did ester before Easter. So if you're going out before those temperatures start getting really warm, you would do the ester type products. But once you start getting warmer daytime temperatures, I would stick with an amine product. Most turf mixtures, I think, are amine based anyway. But if you wanted to do like a 2,4-D Quicksilver mixture in the next, you should be fine with the ester product at this point in time. And then Jim, was another question about, are we going to do an app for the mobile weed manual? I think we're going to stay away from the app at current time. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're going to keep because you're all familiar with the current system, so we don't want to intentionally just break that habit, right? So I think everyone's familiar with mobileweedmanual.com. We kind of want to keep that in place in order so you can keep accessing and using it the way you always have, but the look and feel might be a little bit different. An app is something we've thought about and might introduce down the road. There's ways to have mobileweedmanual.com right now look and feel and perform like an app on your phone. And I'd be happy to talk to you about that in another meeting, but it's on the table for a thing we might do down the road, but I don't think you'll see it in 2021. Question here, what % glyphosate on dormant Bermuda grass for turf weed control? So we don't really recommend a % solution per se. The rates on the label will tell you, I think, Greg, it's like 10 to 44 ounces per acre.
Yeah.
Is the broadcast rate of glyphosate for weed control in dormant Bermuda grass. And, you could get into a % solution if you wanted. We'd like to see those apps go out at 40 gallons per acre. So you can run the math off of 44 ounces in 40 gallons to get to a percentage there, if that's something that you like to operate in. But for a winter annual weed control in dormant Bermuda, there's not any need for the 2, 3, 4, 5% chemical mowing solutions that are on that label.
No, I don't see. I had another question about the ester. I don't think it would be too hot in the cool temperatures for the turf. Do you, Jim? Even if you was going out on Bermuda?
Yeah, I don't think it would either. I wouldn't have a lot of heartburn about that.
Just stay within the labeled ranges.
This question here, what do I think about iNaturalist or Google Lens for weed ID?
I think those are the ones where you take the picture of the weed and it IDs it. Is that correct?
Yeah.
As a semi-botanist, I don't consider myself that great at it. And always amazed at you guys how you can do it. But I've been it doesn't do it perfectly, but it gets you on the right track sometimes. You play around with it. It's really good for trees. I think Lee's used it Lee's likes the Google Lens, which is on everybody's phone anyway. If you've got an Apple phone, it's there right next to the line. The iNaturalist is put out by the National Geographic Society. And so it's pretty free. It's pretty non-commercial. I like those too because they're free, basically free. Probably, behind the scenes, there's probably some money being made. But very, very good, I think.
And Tom, you did a really nice job with the. Talk a little bit about the in-service. What did we call that?
Yeah, I think it was just commercial.
CI. No, it was CI. It was kind of a CI.
CSI. Yeah.
CSI. But explain what's your overview of that? And one thing I've noticed is sometimes at least you get in the ballpark.
Yeah.
For me, somebody that's a novice when it comes to ornamentals and trees, I think it's helpful. I don't know about broadleaf weeds.
Well, broadleaf weeds work better than grasses, obviously.
They
grasses
sure do.
are always difficult. And Kyllinga, forget it. But broadleaf, especially if you have a flower connected to it, sometimes you can just impress your client by pulling that up on your phone and snapping a picture. And then if you can't ID it that way, you can always send it off to either a county agent, and we can sometimes, lots of times, I can get a good picture from a landscaper, and I can take my own camera and snap a picture of a picture sent to me, and that works pretty good too.
Right. I want to share this with the group just for a little bit of levity, but years ago, I knew that Dr. Amy Fulcher was working with what is called a smart sprayer. And in nursery production, there's a keen interest in having a sprayer that will not just spray the entire foliage of a growing plant that's being produced eventually for sale. So at some points, you might want to treat the crotch angles, or you might want to just treat the upper portions of the particular tree or shrub that's being produced. Well, I had trouble sleeping one night, so at 3 a.m, I kind of woke up and I thought, hey, we've got the technology to at least identify broadleaf weeds in turfs, right? So I called my good buddy, and we used to have, I used to work with roadside erosion control and weed control. And so there was a large machine called a Cibolo sprayer. And it was basically a manifold type sprayer that was on a boom that was vertical. And it was attached to the corner of a Oklahoma Department of Transportation vehicle. Okay. And then the operator, the driver, had the ability to activate up to 8 solenoids to adjust the spray distance based on whether, because with the DOT, they're trying to maintain visual safety so that if the motoring public, if somebody has a problem with an automobile and they have to pull off the shoulder, at least they can avoid the culverts and the some of the hidden structures that are out there in the rights of way. So I called Bob Hayes, a good friend of mine, who is still an awesome weed scientist, and he was the director of the West Tennessee Research and Education Center at the time. And so I said, hey, Bob, let's talk a little bit about specifically treating, and I was thinking just zonal treating or treating individual areas of a turf where you knew you had at least broadleaf weeds. You didn't necessarily have to identify the individual species, but you could determine that was a broadleaf weed and make a treatment of something like a Trimec or even a glyphosate. And so I'm thinking he's going to be all excited about it. And I said, we've got the technology. The weed could be identified by the time the bumper passes. And then by the time the boom is in the back of the vehicle, moves across the turf into that area that's been identified as a broadleaf containing area, individual nozzles could be automatically activated to spray that area. And Bob is a man of few words. And so I heard, he thinks he's not like I am. I'm kind of like Odie, and I talk too much and I talk really quickly. And, I don't necessarily think a lot about what I say sometimes. So there was this moment of silence at the other end of the line. And he said, well, I assume that you think it's going to be an economic advantage. And I said, can you imagine how much material savings there would be in terms of the limited amount of, say, glyphosate that would be applied as a spot treatment? And he goes, Tom, there's this thing called supply and demand. If we do this, chances are Monsanto is going to elevate the cost of a gallon of Roundup to accommodate this reduction in volume that's being applied. So my point is, sometimes the technology is advanced beyond what there's some things out there that we don't necessarily consider that may impact how products are received. Another example is the GMOs. Did you know at North Carolina State University they have identified genes that are responsible for brown patch resistance in tall fescue? Okay, unfortunately, in my view, they cannot transfer those genes that they know are impactful in terms of the plant's ability to resist brown patch into the tall fescue varieties, because it would be considered a GMO. So they're having to use traditional breeding protocols to eventually get there. But it's interesting to me that there's a gene complex in tall fescue that will impact resistance to Rhizoctonia or large brown patch. So here's a case where we're kind of all dressed up but no place to go. So I don't know if that has anything to do with what we just talked about, but I did think it was interesting. So my question of Jim and Greg, in your view, I love the way that you go about reviewing, the year in review. And then also, I know that you get with your graduate students or our graduate students and you discuss, okay, what have we done this year? What impact have we made? But I'm asking the question, what technologies or what products do you think have really moved to the forefront in 2020? What excites you to? Or is it just same old, same old?
For me, I don't know that it's more of a product as it's some of the stuff we're learning environmentally with the particularly annual bluegrass
and the Goosegrass.
And the Goosegrass with some of those things. It's probably more of that for me than it is an actual product. Go ahead, Jim. I cut you off, I think.
And Jim, you might want to, I don't know if you've spoken about it because I took a little break, but did you talk about the climatic impact on Goosegrass and the work you're doing?
We talked a little bit about soil moisture and dry conditions and trying to set up applications to do really well. To your question though about technology from 2020 to be excited about, I mean, we're barely into 2021, so I don't know if this counts, but
it counts.
I just learned about Google Lens. I didn't know what that was, so that's really cool, and I'm going to start using that now to be able to answer this question better moving forward. But no, I mean, I think Greg's right. I mean, we probably did more weed biology wise in 2020 than maybe ever before. I mean, it didn't really get into it today, but we're seeing weeds that we have long thought to be annuals persist as perennials in this climate, and that leads to all sorts of different management challenges and understanding why that happens and what microenvironments that might happen in. I think one thing, it's not an individual piece of technology, but maybe a use, is Greg and I have talked for a long time about mixtures in the idea, particularly on some of our more problematic weeds, to be mixing modes of action. And we're seeing that happen now in the fall. And one of the things Greg and I have planned for 2021 is, well, could we expand that to get to a place where maybe this is really simple, that you have a zone defense that you put out late spring and one that you put out late fall. And then those are kind of the bookends of how you go about doing your business. And there's going to be some post chemistry in there, plus some pre-chemistry and mode of action diversity. And we could maybe get into a place where we bookend the year with two really thoughtful apps. And then all we're really concerned about is customer callbacks and touch-ups.
So from a practical perspective, what would be required of a professional lawn care applicator to actually enhance control based on the information you're providing online? You know, where the rubber meets the road, what would I have to do as a professional lawn care applicator to be able to, what is required to be able to maximize, say, goosegrass control based on the model, or annual bluegrass control? Because I remember, you know, you've got a graduate student that just almost went cross-eyed counting annual bluegrass seedlings. You might want to explain that in a little more detail. And Jim, last but not least, let's give Avant Shakova a little nod. You might want to explain what happened there, because it was excellent.
Yeah, I mean, so for those of you who don't know, Avant is a drought stress physiologist who's based in Jackson. And she took some of our preliminary goosegrass observations where we saw differential herbicide performance and dug that apart to get to the place of understanding transpiration that I shared in my presentation about those benchmark requirements that are needed for those herbicides to work well. And if we don't have all the boxes checked, they're not going to do what we want them to do. To your previous comment, Tom, I think that, you know, your question was, how can someone in lawn care take the content that we have online and use it to be most successful?
Because I know how important it is to you and Greg and the team to develop effort to develop projects that truly impact our industry.
Yeah,
which I believe is the best industry.
That's right. And you know, I think, you know, the internet's kind of like, maybe this is a bad metaphor, I don't know, but it's early. I haven't had a whole lot of coffee yet. It's almost kind of like the internet's the modern day library, right? And there's all this stuff available. But when you went into the library when you were a kid, if you wanted to find something, you talked to the librarian to point you in the right direction to get the content that you wanted to have. And, you know, I think 2020 has certainly familiarized all of us more with digital and virtual and the ability to connect with people online. And to your question, Tom, I think the way to be most successful is to reach out through extension, whether it's to your agent or the agent reaches out to the specialist, and we can point you in the direction of the content that you need to be the most successful.
Presenters, Dr. Tom Samples, of course, with the University of Tennessee. He's been speaking quite a bit so far. We're glad to have him on board, of course. And Tom is a professor in the Department of Turfgrass Science and Management, and he did receive his PhD in crop sciences, turfgrass management in particular, from Oklahoma State University. Tom's particularly interested in, you know, the management of turf grasses, ultimately using those research-based sustainable methods for long-term success. And for many years, Tom has developed educational programs that help support turfgrass professionals, us as extension agents, of course, our master gardeners, and homeowners alike. His cohort, Dr. Larry Tankersley, is also with the University of Tennessee, and he acts as an extension specialist in the Department of Forestry, Wildlife, and Fisheries. And Dr. Tankersley specializes in forest management and ecology, forest economics, tree biology, and even some urban arboriculture. Now, as an extension specialist, Dr. Tankersley provides education and outreach to forestry professionals again, us as extension agents, landowners, youth, and even master gardeners. And they are going to co-present today, how successful are your turf renovations? So excited to have both of you on board. Thanks for coming, Tom and Larry.
Glad to be here.
Well, we really appreciate the invitation, you two characters.
You
Good
got it.
job, Tom.
I love it when a plan comes together, and just for our audience, around here they refer to me as Flintstone. I'm long in the tooth. I have a dial-up cell phone, and I'm the world's worst in terms of IT. So I actually practiced moving this from one screen to the other last night, Tom. So we didn't do too badly, did we? Okay, so, and away we go. Well, it's an honor and always a privilege to share a microphone with Larry. He's one of the best, in my view, at what he does, and he does a lot of it. So I'll introduce Larry first. He would be the first to admit he's a dirt forester. And I've learned so much from him over the years. We have this mutual respect for one another, but we argue about which species is the best, whether it's a tree or whether it's the turf. And so you'll probably pick up on this as we progress through these slides. But we wanted to talk a little bit with you today about turf renovation, but I also wanted to talk about turf renovation, and another reason Larry is here is because so many of our turfs that need to be renovated are in shade, and primarily tree shade. So, but let's make sure we know what we're talking about in terms of the term renovation, because there is some misconception. Some people think renovation does not involve chemistry. But the reality is there are two concepts here. A turf management practice for converting an existing stand of weeds or mixed grass species or both into a turf of acceptable species and quality. So that's one definition. Another pretty much directly addresses the use of a herbicide. Lawn renovation involves killing existing turf and replacing it with new grass without tilling or changing the grade, which is normally done during the establishment of a new lawn. So basically, it's utilizing chemistry to reduce competition for the turf that you're introducing without starting over and without reshaping the contour of the existing landscape. So when we think about recovery or renovation, if the turf grasses had a high capacity to recover from damage, we would have to do less renovation. But it's interesting to me, and we're going to focus today primarily on the cool season species, but look at how they vary among the recoverability of these species varies. We talked a little bit earlier about the using fine fescues along with tall fescues in shade, but the issue with the fine fescues is they don't recover very well from damage. They're very slow to recover from damage, even though they require less light compared to the others to sustain a erosion-resistant ground cover. The reality is they're not very well adapted when it comes to their capacity to recover. Kentucky bluegrass is, on the other hand, due primarily to their lateral growth ability. They have a medium-high ability to recover from damage. Perennial ryegrass is medium, and tall fescue is at best medium. And even though some of the tall fescue varieties that we have in the marketplace today have the ability to produce rhizomes, they don't generate rapid lateral growth, similar to what a Bermuda grass would. So that's the other reason that you see the tall fescue recoverability in that medium category. So one reason we have to renovate our turfs in East Tennessee is due to heat and drought. This happened, many of you remember it, in the summer of 2007, was pretty much devastating. I took this slide out at the UTIA Gardens. And to be brutally honest, I would refer to this as toast. The tall fescues were pretty crispy during that particular summer, and we had to do a lot of renovation. And I talked to a lot of lawn care professionals in 2007, and they were really challenged to get all their interseeding done on time that particular year. My good friend, Dr. Tankersley, is going to address shade in just a bit, but basically when we're talking about shade, we've got to remember that the amount, duration, and photosynthetic activity of light turf grasses actually receive is influenced, in addition to trees, buildings, fences, and other landscape features, by clouds. So what I've learned over the last several years is that when we have relatively cloud-free days, we generally have better turfs. And it's during those afternoon showers and those gray days that we can't forget that even a turf that would be in full sun areas in that landscape, if it's been cloudy for 7 days in a row, chances are that turf is not got the energy that it would have had if it had been receiving direct sunlight and plenty of wind. So let's look at the date on this particular comment. Dr. Jim Beard was pretty much the turfgrass science guru back in the 70s. And he moved from Michigan State to the Texas A&M University. And many of you have probably read some of his articles and maybe own his book or books. But back in 1973, he estimated that an estimated 25% or more of managed turf grasses experienced some level of shade stress. And you'll note that he didn't say the grasses were shaded. He said that an estimated 25% or more of the managed turf grasses in 1973 experienced shade stress. So let's think about shade tolerance of these grasses. And we all know that the fine fescues have really good shade hardiness. Unfortunately, they have poor high temperature hardiness. And so here in the South, the same varieties that perform admirably in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maine, Wisconsin, they don't do very well down here in the South in shade, due primarily to a lack of high temperature tolerance. Kentucky bluegrasses are relatively low to medium in their ability to persist in shade. Perennial ryegrass is low to medium, and tall fescue is just medium. Now, do you see anywhere other than on this slide, other than the fine fescues, of these varieties ranking high? So what this tells me is, and this is just a general table, but what this tells me is if you're managing turfs in shade, you're probably going to have to be on your A game in order to provide the level of quality that is anticipated, not necessarily expected, but anticipated from your clientele. Sometimes the client needs to understand that, boy, when it comes to shade, even just a 20% shade can be impactful. And an 80% shade is just darn near impossible. I like the comment about, should I grow moss? My good friend, basically, I don't look at that as, I want you to embrace moss. I want more people to embrace moss in a landscape. Or like Tom mentioned, and Lee, don't underestimate the value of shade-adapted broadleaf ground covers. Tankersley, take it away.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to reiterate is I thought that Jim did a really good job right towards the end of his presentation in expectations. If I know I'm dealing with a shaded environment, I'm not even going to offer to plant some of these things, St. Augustine, even though we're way out of that zone. That's a bad example, obviously. But my expectations as to which of these varieties / species varieties are going to perform in that shaded environment would make a whole lot of difference as a first pass in your decision making.
Well, and I've worked with, I've been getting a lot of questions about pets and about pet lodging, where people have exercise areas where homeowners are leaving for a week and they want to provide their pet an opportunity to experience a new place temporarily. And the business owner that wants to provide a pet activity area, many of those areas in which the pets are active and exercising are shaded. So you know what I've begun to just recommend? Perennial ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, and just consider it an annual turf.
Yeah.
Even though perennial is the word perennial is prior or a prefix or before the word ryegrass. The reality is our perennial ryegrasses in shade behave much like annuals. So, Larry, it's your turn.
All I'll chime in here on is it's very difficult for me to talk to master gardeners, loggers even, any biological audience without reiterating the importance of photosynthesis. It really is where all the energy for, all the food chains that we deal with, all the way down to unsavory as it might be putting gasoline in our car. It all came from ultimately, in my estimation, a large percentage of it anyway, from photosynthesis. So it's really, really important that, and this is one thing, the Tennessee Turfgrass Association, it took them a dozen years before they would invite me back. Because when I introduced myself, I said, obviously I'm dealing with the superior organism because the tree got out of the weeds and pushed itself up. And basically, they didn't invite me back for 12 years. And I understand completely that was a pretty rude statement. And we'll get to the grass's revenge later on. But it's very important that visual part of the light, all the way from 380 to 700, those are the critical wavelengths that we look at to trigger photosynthesis from chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. And I don't want to gag anybody too much on some boring chemistry and physics, but I was kind of the nerd that enjoyed those classes in school. But it is pretty important to understand that, where is your shade and where is your sunshine? And then look at your expectations. I thought Jim made that point earlier, and I'll make it again. Really, grass and trees are sort of an unnatural combination. Again, Jim pointed out we don't see a lot of grass in the woods, and if you go to the Great Plains where there's not a lot of water, you don't see a lot of trees. Cue in on the chloroplast here. This is the organ in all of our green plants, both trees, grasses, annual weeds, these shrubbery. Every plant we're dealing with out there, it's very important for each of us to understand not necessarily every little idiosyncrasy of this thing, but that chloroplast is really, really important. And then understanding the genetic capacity, shade tolerance versus it will not tolerate shade at all. Those concepts are very important, both in forest management, and now I'm coming to see in landscape management as well. So it's very important to understand what's going on with the slide like this. Even, if I've got 200 shrubs to plant today, it's pretty important to understand at a fundamental level this has to take place. And there you go, Tom. What else do we need to say?
Well, the only thing I was going to say is that late in my career, probably one of the last paragraphs I'm going to write, it won't be a poem because it's tough to rhyme for me. But I'm going to start, the title of this is going to be an ode to the chloroplast. Okay? Because think about that. That's one organ in a cell that without it, none of us would be here on Zoom today.
Well, that's very true, and that's one reason I don't mind saying, that chlorophyll is the most important molecule, and And then basically what we do is land managers, plant managers, is we budget the energy. So, you know, when a plant dies, it ran out of energy is what I typically say. So you've constantly got to be making energy. And when I don't give the master gardeners too hard a time, but you really can't feed a tree. It's got to feed itself. And we'll talk about roots here for the balance of the program. But enough said about that, but it's a very important limiting factor. Basically, what you see here is you can see the wavelengths that are absorbed both in the sunshine. Obviously, the area under the sunshine curve seems to be greater than the area under the shade curve, and that's just a measurement of the amount of energy that's actually available for plant growth on that particular square area.
So
you can
so
see
Larry,
the wavelengths. You can see the wavelengths that are absorbed by plants primarily.
and so Larry, the gray area or the gray line would be incoming light that potentially could be intercepted by the tree leaves at the expense of the turf, which would be growing below.
Well, that's exactly a very, very, thanks for jogging my mind under that is basically all the good light is caught by the canopy of the trees. So that's the photosynthetically active radiation is peeled out by the canopy of the trees before the grass can get it. So the grass is growing the best it can, given the quality and the quantity of light that's provided in that shaded area.
And then what do we as homeowners do to turf and shade?
We've got a few pictures here later on. This is an interesting situation here with that swing. The kids had obviously gouged out that lower area, and that root took advantage of that softer area. And, you've had secondary growth along that plane right there with that large root exposing itself.
Well, and what this does is I always try to include this slide because it makes me think if it's August and you need to be out of doors because you're an out of doors, you really value being out of doors. It's August. Where do you likely end up in the landscape during the heat of the summer? I'm not going to go out to the area receiving full sun out by the curb. I'm going to be, where am I going to put my lawn chair? So sometimes our clientele is attracted to areas of the landscape that are not best suited for turf, right? So I want to talk a little bit about renovation and some requirements. When we think about renovation, I always think about interseeding because what we're doing is we're trying to increase the stand density. But in order to do so in an existing turf, we're not going to be pulling a rototiller into that area and starting over. Remember, this is the renovation rule or the renovation definition. So what I need to do is figure out a way to selectively cultivate the turf without severely damaging the turf, yet exposing a certain amount of soil such that I have seed to soil contact. And I think you've heard me say before, I used to be a grain grader at a local farmers co-op in Middle Ohio. And one year we were taking in wheat in the spring, and we had so much rain, a certain percentage of the wheat kernels had germinated. Okay, so I was calling Pillsbury and all the mills that we were shipping to find out what kind of a dockage that I would have to charge my clients, because I was going to be charged a dockage if the pre-germinated wheat kernel could not be used for flour production. Okay, so what I learned quite quickly was a seed can germinate in air, right? in order for a seed to germinate, the first step of seed germination is the seed taking up moisture. And inside that seed is basically an embryo that's just raring to go. So you can imagine, I mean, how many of you have seen wheat seed or cereal grain or some seed actually germinate 5 feet or 3 feet or 2 feet above the soil surface? So it's critically important that we, as turfgrass professionals, that we ensure that we do all we can do to ensure seed to soil contact. So we've got a couple of options. One would be linear cultivation, or at least we come up with a method to part the thatch such that we expose the soil surface such that the seed will contact soil, or we as professionals choose to use core aerifiers prior to broadcasting seed, or we use an implement called an aero seeder that actually is a core aerifier with a seed box on top. So what we're doing is we're selectively cultivating the turf. Well, here's a table that I wanted to share with you regarding how much actual displacement there is as a result of using either a dethatcher or a core aerifier. So not to be too, I know this is a pretty busy slide, but let's take a look at a 1/2 inch tine diameter on a core aerifier. And let's take a look at a 2.5 by 2.5 inch aeration coring pattern. Okay, so if we're using a core aerifier on a turf in a landscape, and the implement footprint is 2.5 by 2.5 inches. It's 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches from hole to hole. We're only affecting 3.1% of the surface area. Okay, so we have to get down to a 1.5 by 1.5 inch pattern with a 1/2 inch diameter coring tine to get almost 9% of the surface area. So we're talking about really impacting less than 10% of the total surface area of that lawn in preparation for broadcast seeding. But look at the vertical mower, or think about that slit seeder that you may have access to. It's slow. It's nowhere near as fast as core aerification and broadcast seeding, but just look at the vertical mower with 1 inch spacings width from disc to disc. And in this particular instance, this was a 15 blade vertical mower, and each blade was on 1 inch spacing. If you used a 2 millimeter blade width, with one pass, you're impacting 8%. When you cross vertical mow, and one thing we've learned over the years is don't go at a 90-degree angle, go at a 30, 60-degree angle. And for some reason, the seedling emergence, as they emerge, the seedlings merge, the turf appears to cover quicker versus a 90-degree angle. But the reality is, if you make 2 passes with a vertical mower prior to broadcasting seed, you've just exposed almost 16% of the surface area. So chances are you're going to see initially much more seed germination within those areas in which you've parted the thatch and the seed is placed in rows. So aerification decisions, and that's why Larry and I included the term, have you considered? You know, if you've got a turf and a client that, you know, is let's say that you've got a high priority landscape and there's really a weakened area, and you're traditionally using core aeration prior to broadcast seeding, you may have some landscapes that you're going to have to bite the bullet and say, okay, I'm going to use a linear displacement machine, and just because I need to expose more soil such that I hopefully have greater potential for success and greater stand density improvement on these high profile landscapes. So by definition, we're talking about renovation, but as a general rule, we believe that if 50% of the turf consists of varieties and species that you want to manage. If 50% or more is existing, there's no need for you to start over. So just let's think about renovating an area like this. What do you think happened here? What caused the discoloration and the zonal dieback? This is in the UTI Gardens.
Oh, okay.
Now,
traffic maybe?
Yeah. Believe it or not, at first look, I thought that was just large brown patch or brown patch. But the reality is, and see, our gardens are not irrigated. The beds are irrigated, but the turf's not irrigated unless the staff decides to do some spot irrigation. So this is simply as a result of turfgrass wear and soil compaction. Now, so the question becomes, which would be more effective? Core aerifying ahead of overseeding, or slit seeding with a slicing type seeder that's just going to part the thatch? See, here's a case where I want to do both. I want to try to relieve soil compaction with a core aerifier, and then while the cores are up, I'm going to use the dethatcher or the slit seeder to help break those soil cores that are on the surface and redistribute that soil into the thatch that creates a condition known as MAT, M-A-T, in which water moves quickly through compared to thatch. But I've just relieved a certain amount of the soil compaction so that those seedlings can emerge in a soil that's been relatively loosened. So there's in some cases you want to double up on and use both. But I want to show you these slides. This is just a sequence of slides. Many of you have seen these before. Had a good friend that had a lawn in West Knoxville. Her son was very young and she was a single mom, and she wanted to improve the overall quality of the lawn. Well, this particular lawn at this point is about 70% Bermuda, 20% crabgrass, and a little bit of tall fescue. So now, had this been Tom samples in 2020, I might have just suggested, Gene, let's do this. Let's just convert this to Bermuda grass. Would have been a little easier. But we wanted to, I said, I need a really good series of slides, and you want tall fescue apparently. So let's see if we can accommodate this. But as many of you know, years ago, when we were building homes in areas that were formerly cropped, as part of the cash flow situation, a lot of the topsoil that was moved during construction and preparation for home building was sold. So, and then of course the landscape was shaped. Well, the homeowner a year later finds out that they're actually managing landscape plants and turfs in less than ideal, low topsoil, low organic matter soils. And so in this particular case, I told her, I said, you could land a 747 on this front yard and it might divot, but not much. This lawn was as hard as a rock. The soil was very hard, probably about 80% clay, which is not uncommon here in East Tennessee. So we went out, and Greg, if you're on this call, I think you sprayed this Roundup for us out at Gene Halsey's property, but this is an application of Roundup. Now, it was a little late. We made this application in mid-September. I say we, but I delegated this by way of my good friend Greg Breeden. He will work for food. But anyway, so he sprayed this out. And then my good friend Mark Sharp with My Personal Gardener down in Maryville, he agreed to come in and handle the renovation process. So now the key here is note that Mark, being the business owner, he's riding the core aerifier. As somebody that has leased many core aerifiers, I have not found a riding core aerifier for lease. I have walked behind core aerifiers across many turfs that were in need of renovation, and Mark did let me make one pass with this machine. So I'm proud that I can say that, hey, I've been on one. But the reality is, came in and core aerified. Then he had this, notice that this is called, was at that point, it's Lesco, the Lesco Renovator 20. But basically, it was a dethatcher with a seed box on top. But what I wanted to point out here is, look where the seed is being dropped. See, the seed is being dropped ahead of the tillage rather than behind. And that's advantageous in my view. And I think what it results in is more of the seed actually falls between the rows that are being created by the dethatching blades themselves. And there's a more uniform emergence. But, and I'm sure most of you have seen the resultant, tall fescue seedlings coming up in rows first in a row pattern before the seed between the rows is actually germinated and starting to the seedlings starting to emerge. Of course, then we fertilized and in so many lawns in West Knoxville, very high levels of phosphorus. So we basically made the fertilization based on soil test, and we put out very little phosphorus. As I recall, this was predominantly a nitrogen-containing, potash-containing fertilizer. We wanted to address the lack of organic matter below the thatch layer in the soil itself. Now, the turf grasses produce a lot of organic matter as thatch, but it's on the soil surface. And so what I hoped to do for Gene was to improve the organic matter content below the soil, below the turf surface, such that the soil became a little more pliable, had more organic material. The organic material could eventually release nutrients to the turf. Early on, it ties the microbes as they're breaking down this organic matter, they actually tie up nitrogen and then re-release it upon their death. But so we did have to come in and supplement. We made a second application of nitrogen alone a little later during the process. But here's a case where we took a soil that was rock hard, very low in organic material, and just by using a granular top dressing material, this happened to be, those of you that are in around the Knoxville area, you remember the old green waste facility in Solway, where that's where this granular top dressing material came from. So this is what it looked like right before Thanksgiving. Actually, right before Halloween, I'm sorry. Right before Halloween. So when's Halloween, Tank? Larry?
October 31st.
That's what I'm talking about. So we noticed the jack-o'-lantern. So now we started this process in September, in mid-September, in terms of the first glyphosate application. Now we're looking at the end of October, a little bit later, starting to see the seedlings emerge. This is what it looked like up close, but note that even with some of the best top dressing materials, there's still a certain amount of larger particles that will move to the surface or stay on the surface, and the finer materials will kind of move down through the thatch. And I didn't take a picture of the I could have taken a soil profiler and shown you how the organic material moved into the aeration channels. And of course, this is near Christmas, and look at how the turf has really moved along since the seed was broadcast. So this was, now those of you that, no need to apply the glyphosate, don't apply the glyphosate. But you can also implement the same protocol without the chemistry. And hopefully you would result in the same beneficial impact. Now for the best part of this presentation, again, I want Larry Tankersley to take it from here.
Okay, that was good, Tom. Like I said, I appreciate the renovation. I do draw everyone's attention. Perhaps I'm not sure that was a renovation or a reestablishment, but we don't need to split hairs. What I wanted to do is run through a few slides. I think Tom was present when he named this things to consider. We get a lot of calls like this from a lot of metro areas, recently developed areas. Whenever anybody talks about fertilization, I get a little bit nervous. I'm notoriously cheap, and even to the point of not really spending a lot of money on fertility. But in a tree situation right here, a lot of times what we're talking about, this is a swag on my part, but it appears to me that this tree was over fertilized. And what I mean by that is we probably wrote our fertilizer prescription for the turf grass that's underneath this tree. And by default, the tree has had to pay. It has grown a lot of extra tissue. If you look at the extremities of these branches, you can see what I consider a defensive dieback. The plant is not likely to fail completely. Of course, it's still got a reasonably good looking canopy, although a little chlorotic for me beating on it for over fertilizer. But a lot of times we'll get a situation where a plant is over fertilized, and it's basically because we put more fertilizer on the yard than it really needed. We'll talk a little bit about that. Usually turf and shade really don't need a lot of extra nitrogen, and a lot of folks like myself, Lee Rumble, and a few other tree enthusiasts, we typically recommend cutting the fertility recommendation for turf in about half as you approach the drip line of the tree. But in this situation, I'm considering that the tree picked up the extra nitrogen. It was pretty proud to have it, and the result was a lot of extra tissue growth in the crown. And then we hit these August, September, October months where that tissue can't be supported by the root system. There's just not enough water in the system. So on behalf of the rest of the tree, that excess tissue dies back.
Tank, the excess tissue you're talking about is basically, at one point there were leaves all the way to the tips of those vertical stems.
Right. I would say in the springtime that'd be true. Okay. And then, as we say, I think the critical item there is to consider is a defensive dieback. A lot of our customers will ask us, will that tree die? And my smart comment is no, but it'll look so bad we wish it would, because a lot of those branches, they just won't exactly recover the shape that you wanted. And then here's the other lesson that I will take from this slide, and we can move on, Tom. A lot of times a tree that is planted into no, Tom, go back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
A tree that's planted in an existing turf, is at a pretty significant disadvantage when it comes to water competition, because the turf was there and the tree's roots have had a hard time wallering out their respective space in this underground area, and we'll show some pictures later on. But that's the main thing. Usually when Tom was showing that cooked turf grass that he ultimately replaced, a lot of times if you put turf underneath an established tree in times of drought, the tree will actually win that battle with an established root system. So it really just depends on which root system is on site first, and how competitive the introduction is going to be. Go ahead to the next slide, Tom. What I want to beat on this, I have a real good talk that I really thoroughly enjoy giving. Don't want to be too much self-promotion here, but if you ever get a chance to talk about a pruning talk, pruning here is if you kind of ignore the stop sign, although that's one of the reasons that we would do this kind of crown raising pruning, is if you can get that crown up and out of the way, you get a significant amount of sunlight that will stream in underneath that crown, and that's going to help resolve your turf grass situation in so many situations. Everybody likes to see grass right up to the trunk of the tree, but if you've got a bunch of drooping branches or branches that are impeding that the angle of that sunshine through the course of the day, you're going to be disappointed with the performance of the grass underneath that tree. So judicious pruning is certainly an answer to a lot of our problems trying to improve our turf grass situation. Go ahead, Tom. Just another shot here. This looks like it was a little bit more ambitious crown thinning. A lot of times we'll send a climber into a tree and they can take out up to, a quarter to a third of the material. A lot of times that can be before a lot of that dead material falls on the ground and ultimately has to be picked up. But you can certainly see that you can get a lot more sunlight streaming through that canopy. It's a phenomenon we might call transmissivity. You get a lot more light transmitted through that after than you would before. So that's another option that you can do to maybe improve your turf performance underneath the tree.
So Larry, we're talking about two different things. One would be elevation, and then the other one would be crown thinning.
Right.
Okay.
And either one would be good. I'm pretty fond of aggressive pruning, especially early in the life of a tree. I put this book here. Several of you folks that have seen me talk before, I like to show this. This is the landscape below ground. It's you can see some of the names here. Gary Watson, pretty notorious tree researcher. I believe he's still at Florida. I'm not positive, but they've had 4 or 5 of these meetings, and I always remind people, I say, can you imagine the excitement of 250 people getting together to talk about tree roots?
It's like a bankers convention.
Right. Yeah, almost like a grass convention or something.
Oh gosh.
But what we really want to notice here is you hear several things in the parlance. Most of us are familiar with the drip line of a tree, but what I would encourage everyone to recognize is well beyond the drip line of that tree is where a large proportion of your finer roots, the roots that are collecting water and essential elements, and then ultimately transporting back those. I try to get away from drip line and really encourage people to understand that it's probably the shadow line is what we really would look at. Is if you can imagine the shadow of that tree pirouetting around the trunk there through the course of the day as the sunshine moves. So it's important. The other thing that I would encourage you to do, and we'll see with the next slide, is really how shallow that is. I've disappointed a lot of grown men when I remind them that a lot of times they tap root with certain exceptions of coarse soils where you do get deep rooting, sandier soils. Usually a tap root on an oak tree or something like that is by the time it gets any maturity to it at all, it's a bit of an artifact. Those roots spread out. The other tension that we have is within that root zone where your turf grass is concentrated in those top 3-4 inches roots of your turf grass. Well, there's feeder roots on your tree that are in that zone as well. So this is where we say a lot of times if your grass roots are in the shade, you can pretty much be sure that you probably also have a fair amount of tree roots in that area. The grass may, for whatever reason, need the extra nutrition for any kind of pedestrian traffic or any other kind of problems that it may be having. But your tree, for the most part, once it gets as mature as this tree we're looking at here, it's not needing a lot of excess nutrition. So anything you add to the system just by artifact, the tree is going to pick that up. And in certain situations, it's true. It's very little consequence. But if that carries on, the tree can put on the excess tissue that we were trying to discourage with the first photo that I was showing you. So a lot of times, what a tree guy like myself would say is mulch around the drip line. If you noticed with the some pictures, and I'll show these later. But it's very important, and a lot of my concern was with Tom's activity in that 3 to 4 or 5 inch root zone. If you get too carried away, you can do a whole lot of damage to that root mat by going too deep with your lawn renovation and or any kind of cultivation that's going on. I think the very shallow system that Tom was advocating, the 2 inches to even, down to 3, you may actually improve the performance of your tree more by getting that thatch out of there. You get better gas exchange, carbon dioxide comes out, oxygen goes in, good water infiltration, and just a good general tilth in that root area from that light cultivation that Tom's advocating with his renovation system. Now, what I would say though is when you start getting into some of those larger roots that are closer to the trunk of the tree, or get too aggressive with these transport roots, you can do some damage. And then the irony is going to be is they're going to call a smart guy like Lee Rumble out there, and they're not going to notice the damage to the tree for several months after the turf damage has already been done. So that's another little note here. The tree's not going to respond real quickly, but when it comes to a droughty situation and the tree really needs to absorb a lot of water, if I've done any damage to the roots in the interim. Now, the good part is I think that you're in a good position with the tree by doing the renovation in the months that Tom was suggesting. The later months, there's not a lot of water in the system anyway. And those tree roots are actually starting to grow a little bit to store any kind of dormancy that the tree's coming up with. And if I'm getting too carried away, Lee, you and Doug, let me know.
Larry, what I love though is as a turf guy, when I look at this, the first time I looked at this, I didn't really appreciate the fact that, okay, look, we've got a zone of anchor roots, then we've got transport roots, and then we've got feeder roots.
Well, we'll get to that in a couple of more slides, Tom, but hold on with that slide. The important thing for our fellows that are out there doing the work every day, it's just kind of important to understand where are those roots. And I'm not telling you can't walk around out there, you can't operate, but when you start getting very, very deep, you're starting to affect, if you get into those anchor roots, now you're talking about structural integrity. If you damage those anchor roots, all of a sudden you've created a hazard tree. And you may not see the Ganoderma conchs come up off that tree for 2 or 3 years after that damage has taken place. So this is pretty important. And then to understand that those feeder roots are right in there with your turf. They're right in there with your turf. And that's where I'm referring. If you put a young little old tree in there, that turf grass has got a significant advantage on collecting water, But if you try to plant grass under established tree, the grass has got an equally difficult dilemma in trying to form its root system, competing with that tree. And usually a pretty large tree is pretty effective at collecting all the water that's available. Go ahead, Tom, hit that slide.
Well, I was just going to say, now that diagram is awesome, but here's the real world. My good friend, Dr. Alan Wyndham, who many of you know is an awesome pathologist, he sent me this slide. So pretty much demonstrates the schematic that you just showed, Larry.
Well, the real point is where are the roots? And then the other point is that,
in my case, where's the mulch?
Well, it's very stressful, but what I would say is it swells my heart to be an honorary member of the Turf Nerds, because between Alan and Tom and Brosnan and Greg, well, I don't want to blow too much smoke. Go ahead.
Well, you're an adjunct member of the turf team.
Yeah, we have a good time. Now, here's the solution that we would really like to recommend. We don't have to light here too long. I don't know how many of us are actually involved in designing the landscape. If you have any say in the design of the landscape, I'm sure in the trade magazines you've been beat over the head, at least for the last decade, to create these little islands. and all of a sudden you've got some pretty dramatic separation between the tree root zone and the zone where you're trying to grow turf. I think that if we talk to the managers here, with the exception of the maintenance of those smaller little islands, we're probably much happier with the performance of the respective plants separated rather than forcing the two to be together. So this may not be something that the average operator can get around in front of here, but these are the kind of things we think we can recommend. You would have a lot fewer problems with your trees and probably fewer problems with your turf. Now I know there's a few folks sitting there that are telling me, you just showed me pictures and we know dang good and well all those tree roots are running out under that grass, and that's true. One of the most maddening responses to a question people get from me is they say, well, how far should I use? And I'm like, as much room as you got. I can't really say, your customer has a tolerance for how they want that to look. But then we also just showed that the trees actually could use all the space that you can give them. So it really just depends on the confines of the plat of the job that you're actually operating on. Go ahead, Tom. I've been using this for years. Actually, you can see it's a horizontal slice 6 inches down. Conceptualize that the trunk of that tree is coming out towards you. What this shows basically is just a horizontal slice of looking down on a root system. Those smaller absorbing roots, they're ephemeral, they're coming and going. You'll get a die-off in a bad droughty situation, and that same set of nodes will throw out a proliferation of roots later on in the year. The main thing that I really like to see is, take care, Jim. The main thing that I like to see here is when people ask how close to the tree can I get, conceptually you could draw concentric rings around the tree. And you can see that if you've got to put a sewer line or a pipeline in somewhere, the closer you get to the tree, the more damage you're actually doing to the root system. Now, this may or may not be lethal. Again, there's implications on the structural integrity of the root system, just holding the tree up. I tell a joke here in Knoxville one time. A fellow named Steve Garton and I went out, and those 8 to 10 big roots emanating from the trunk, they were laying on the top of the ground. They must have been as big around as my leg, and the guy was sweating. He had worked really hard trying to take all those roots out, and I was looking for a place to get out of the way. I don't know how that tree was standing there without any, all of the big support roots at the base of the tree dug out. So. No doubt they lost that tree, but that might have been their intention all along. I really don't know.
But Larry, as a turf person, I want to suggest to the audience that, how many of you have been asked by a client, hey, how come the turf in this one zone is so good, and then you move over 9 inches and there's nothing? Well, look at the competition and the lack of uniformity of rooting within that diagram or that schematic right there. So you can see that you can imagine the turf that's in close proximity to that massive number of feeder roots would have much more difficulty sustaining itself than in between those areas.
Well, it's really kind of which one came first, but I agree with Tom. The main thing there is to kind of understand that your tree roots are there. That's right there where they are. So you just need to be aware of that. And go ahead, Tom. This is just another, my friend, anytime you want to look this stuff up, I'm just parroting Dr. Kim Coder at Georgia. I hope most of y'all that are true tree enthusiasts have found Dr. Coder. Very useful over the history. He and I both are getting a little bit long in the tooth, but Kim does a really good job. He's actually quantified that. So if your root zone activity has to get within number 5 right there in that critical zone, you probably should go ahead and just take the tree out while the bulldozer's there. because there's a good chance that tree will fail, sometime in the future. And depending on the structure and the tree, it could cost a whole lot more money to take it down later than it would be right there during the construction. And that's spoken as a tree advocate in my own self. But and then go ahead, Tom. We also do this when people ask, how far should you mulch that area? Again, my stock answer is as much mulch as you can stand to use, space that you can use. But certainly we recommend that primary resource area, the 2.5 times the diameter of the tree in inches. Being a dirt forester, we're measuring that at breast height, DBH, and that's 4.5 feet above ground. But if you could mulch on out to that exploration area, you'd be even better in terms of performance of your tree. And unapologetically, we're talking on the tree side now. But certainly, as you get closer to the trunk of that tree, your turf grass is not, the performance on each one is compromised. So it's either all grass or all trees. So the compromise in the middle goes back to Dr. Brosnan's expectations.
Speaking of Dr. Brosnan.
Yes, speaking of Dr. Brosnan.
Great Breeden.
Some of the first times that I had the good fortune of working with Jim and Greg was plant diagnostics. And ironically enough, this was showing up here. I've been a huge fan of chemistry. Again, I told you I was kind of a nerdy guy in school and studied a lot of chemistry. So I just fell right in with the pesticide bunch, mostly the herbicide crowd. And what we're starting to see increasingly is if we're really not very careful with our chemistry, we can get damage like this on our woody plants, on our trees. So what's happening here is a product like dicamba, banval, those are picked up by the root system of the tree. So if you apply a general weed killer in a turfgrass scenario targeting broadleaf weeds, you really need to see where that chemistry is taken up. We're seeing more and more reactions to trees, and I'll go out there and the lawn is immaculate. Very few weeds in the lawn, but you look up in the hickory tree or the ash tree or oaks or whatever else is in the canopy there, and they're starting to see this cupping and other associated damage, and you can just kind of scratch yourself and spit and say, yeah, herbicide damage. And then you look at the label of what they used, and there's 2,4-D or dicamba mixed in with whatever else they were trying to use. And I'm not knocking any particular product, but it is kind of become incumbent on us as people that are spraying this material around to be responsible for what it does. The few cases that I've seen here, it's usually a fairly well-established, healthy tree. This reaction here is gone in about 4 to 6 weeks, maybe a couple of months. The tree just loses this set of leaves here, and then you just gets on with life, and you would hardly ever know that it was dosed. But, if you get carried away with the too high dose, and again, we know the dose is the poison, so you've really got to be careful. Check the label. I tell all the applicators that I work with is how do you know it wasn't herbicide damage? And they go, well, and I say, because you got records.
Yeah.
You got records that prove what you did that day. And the product that you're accusing me of using, I didn't use. So that's
Tom, I believe we're running a little long. Are we long?
Okay, we definitely are, and I'm about done.
Okay.
Know your products, use them according to label. I believe you ought to read the label when you prescribe it, read it before you go to bed, and read it before you use it. Look for volatility. Those of you that are also spraying Towel Star for mosquitoes, it's an insecticide. Be real careful with these things. I think Greg Breeden mentioned any kind of inversion or any kind of volatilization. especially when we get in these hot summer months. You got to be real careful. When I brought up that towel star, we burned some leaves a few years ago. Sprayed, it was 95 degrees. They were spraying for mosquitoes and kind of, burned up the leaves. And on an herbicide label, trees are broadleaf weeds. So that's just make that point right clear. Don't have to say trees. Trees are broadleaf weeds. So.
And Larry, the other thing that in many cases, like you and I were talking yesterday, it may not be the herbicide itself. It may be actually the emulsifier in that herbicide formulation.
Very much so. Very much.
We've got just 2 more slides. I wanted to talk a little bit or just remind everybody that when you are introducing new seed, you have to pretty much know when the last application of the Preemergence herbicide was made and how long is that herbicide going to persist in the soil so that you're not going to result or cause seedling injury as a result of having pre-emergence herbicide residuals. So just as a reminder, Benefin is the product Bayland. Normally has about a 22 to 80 day half-life depending on the soil and the soil organic matter. The thiopyr is Dimension. It's going to have about a half-life of 40 days on average. So basically it's a moderate persistence in the soil. Arizolan is the product Surfland. Many of you have used it over in the past. It can range from 20 to 128 days based on the herbicide handbook. Pendimethalin or Preem, many of you remember Pendulum, it's about 76 to 98 days. But one of the products that I really like is Barricade, and that's prodiamine. And look at the average half-life of 120 days. So many of you may be putting down Barricade for annual bluegrass control in the fall, and you're finding that you're getting some crabgrass control the following spring. So the half-life is, upwards of 120 days. And then, of course, trifluralin is the product Treflan. It's normally 45 to 60 days. But the neat thing about these pre-emergence herbicides is they're very, for the most part, they're very insoluble. So they're not going to really move much below the area in which you treat. So I think that's an advantage. Now, some of the broadleaf herbicide applications that you're making, those products may be much more soluble and may have a tendency to move below the soil surface. This is our last slide, and this is for Larry to sum up.
Yeah, I think that trees and turf are certainly preferred. Human beings, that's some of our vegetative preferences. So to make them compatible, selectively prune your trees. Consider where the shade is, and if you can prune the shade out and maybe move your tree's canopy to a different direction. Minimize compaction as best you can. A lot of these places, as Tom says, these are places we want to be. The other point I would make is trees actually tolerate compaction once they're established. So I'm not too fastidious about that. I went to a church where we parked under the trees and they never seemed to mind. Reduce irrigation. I thought Greg had a good slide there. We're mighty proud when we put our irrigation in and then we kill all our vegetation by drowning the plants. So be real careful. Don't mean to be too smart about that, but I said it. But and whenever I water my trees, it's usually occasionally, and I ran it very deep. I've got my old pie pan analogy. I'll use a wave sprinkler and put a pie pan out there. When the pie pan's is full, it's got an inch of water, and I go away for 2 or 3 weeks. Careful fertilization. I'm really skittish about nitrogen. Not only does it run off pretty fast and pollute water, but I'm not ever sure. My trees very seldom need it. They will certainly use it, but you could get dieback later on in the hot months when you can't support that with water. Generous mulch to the extent, not real deep, no more than 4 inches, 2 to 4 inches. Ground covers are fine. Everybody wants to plant tulips and bulbs and all kinds of things around that mulch bed that we established for the tree. And that's all right, as long as you don't get real deep. I'm real skittish about airflow. We're all good plant people. We love to load up the yard, and then all of a sudden, if the wind is blowing outside the yard and the air still is a train right there, and it just creates a lot of fungus. Zone plantings, zone pesticide treatments, those might be preferable than broadcast treatments, depending on what you're trying to do. And then, realistic expectations. And in our defense as contractors, this is probably where I think extension could help you a lot. They may believe us when you're having trouble explaining a concept to somebody. It's kind of like my grandmother wanted that dog bone knob cut off, and we had taught Lee to prune with natural pruning, and she sent him back up in the tree because she wanted a flush cut. And I kept telling her, Grandma, that young man knew what he was doing. So if you missed that joke, we need to have a pruning talk next year.
That's right.
Real proud to be with y'all. It's always good to work with Tom, Greg, and the team. And everybody be safe and make lots of money this year.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Larry and Tom, for that great presentation.